Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. In the comments, I would love it if you could tell us where you are listening from and maybe what cryptids pique your interest. Now for today's stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Schneller Geist. The Appalachian autumn had painted the mountains in violent strokes of crimson and gold, but beneath that picturesque veneer, something ancient stirred in the hollows of western Maryland. The dense woods that clung to the rugged terrain had been silent witnesses to centuries of human struggle, but now they whispered of older things, predators that had stalked these hills long before the first German immigrants cleared the land. Dale Morrison and his nephew Keith had been hunting these woods since Keith was old enough to hold a rifle. They knew every ridge, every deer trail, every hollow where the big bucks bedded down. On the morning of October 14th, they set out before dawn, their breath misting in the chill air, expecting nothing more than a successful harvest and venison for the winter. They never returned. Search teams found Dale's orange hunting vest first, shredded and blood-soaked, caught on the thorns of a wild blackberry bush nearly 12 feet off the ground. The fabric hung there like a grotesque flag, the kind of marker that spoke of violence beyond comprehension. 20 yards deeper into the forest, they discovered Keith's rifle, his grandfather's Winchester, split cleanly down the middle as if struck by lightning, the barrel twisted into an impossible spiral. Sheriff Bill Hargrove knelt beside the scattered evidence, his weathered face creased with confusion. He'd seen bear attacks before. He'd investigated hunting accidents, territorial disputes, even the occasional meth cook gone wrong in these backwoods. But this was different. The blood trail led upward, droplets clinging to branches 30 feet high, smears on the bark of ancient oaks that no human could have reached. It was as if something had dragged them into the sky. "Bear," Sheriff Hargrove announced to the assembled search party, though his voice lacked conviction. "Must have been a big one. Probably dragged 'em up a tree, cached 'em for later." But the gathered hunters and volunteers exchanged uneasy glances. Bears didn't cache prey in trees. They didn't leave blood trails that defied gravity. And they sure as hell didn't split rifles like they were made of wet cardboard. Old Man Harkness stood at the edge of the search perimeter, his rheumy eyes fixed on the treetops. At 78, he'd seen enough to know when official explanations failed to capture the truth. He muttered something under his breath, something that the wind carried to Deputy Sarah Chen's ears. "The thing that ain't natural, it's awake again." When Deputy Chen asked him to repeat himself, Harkness just shook his head and shuffled away, his cane leaving twin trails in the fallen leaves. He didn't need to explain. The old-timers knew. The German families who'd settled these hills in the 1800s had brought their folklore with them, stories whispered from generation to generation about the Schneller Geist, the speed ghost, the thing that came from above. The official report cited probable bear attack, victims presumed deceased, bodies unrecovered. But in the taverns and church basements of the small mountain communities, a different narrative took root. 2 men had been taken by something that hunted from the sky, something that had claimed these woods as its territory long before the first colonists set foot on the continent. And it was hungry. Lena Garner arrived 3 days later, her ancient Subaru Forester rattling up the winding mountain roads that led to the town of Millbrook. She'd driven through the night from Baltimore, fueled by black coffee and the desperate hope that this story, this impossible grotesque mystery, might be the scoop that salvaged her career. 5 years ago, Lena had been a rising star at the Baltimore Tribune. She'd broken stories that mattered, corruption in the mayor's office, police cover-ups, corporate malfeasance that had cost people their homes and lives. But her last investigation had gone sideways. A source had lied to her, fed her fabricated documents, and she'd run with a story that turned out to be entirely false. The retraction had been front-page news. The lawsuit had bankrupted her. The industry had blacklisted her. Now she was 34, divorced, living in a studio apartment she could barely afford, writing listicles about haunted locations for a conspiracy website that paid $50 per article. When she'd seen the initial reports about the missing hunters, the strange details that the mainstream media had glossed over, she'd known. This was her chance. This was the story that could bring her back. She checked into the Millbrook Motor Court, a depressing establishment where the neon vacancy sign flickered with the rhythm of a failing heartbeat. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and cigarettes, a combination that triggered memories of her father's death in a VA hospital. She unpacked her laptop, her recorder, and the box of research materials she'd hastily assembled. The Schneller Geist. The name had appeared in her initial web searches, buried in obscure folklore databases and amateur cryptid hunter forums. But Lena had dug deeper, accessing newspaper archives through a library database subscription she could barely afford. And there, in the yellowed pages of the Cumberland Daily Times from 1873, she'd found the first mention. "Winged terror strikes," the headline proclaimed. 7 men dead, monster described as dragon of the Germans. The article described something that defied natural explanation: a creature with leathery wings, a beak like sharpened iron, and a single eye that glowed with malevolent intelligence. It had attacked the Schneider Ironworks, a German-owned mining operation in the hills outside what was now Millbrook. 7 miners had died in a single night, their bodies found in conditions that echoed the present-day disappearances: crushed, partially consumed, arranged in patterns that suggested not just predation but ritual. Lena read the subsequent articles with growing fascination and dread. The attacks had continued for 3 months, always at night, always targeting isolated individuals or small groups. The creature seemed to favor the area around the ironworks, and speculation abounded that it had emerged from something the miners had uncovered in their excavations. Then, in February 1874, the attacks had stopped. Just stopped. No explanation, no final confrontation, no dead beast to parade through town. The Schneider Ironworks had closed shortly after, officially due to financial difficulties, though contemporary letters suggested the owners had been terrified into abandoning the property. 50 years later, in 1924, a similar pattern had emerged. 7 disappearances in the Millbrook area over 3 months, all with the same signature: evidence of violent abduction, blood trails leading upward, bodies never recovered. The local newspaper had made veiled references to the old German curse, but the national press had been distracted by bootleggers and jazz, and the story had faded from memory. Another 50 years, 1974, Lena found 4 confirmed disappearances that fit the pattern, though the records were sparser: a Boy Scout troop leader, a pair of hikers, an elderly woman checking her moonshine still, all vanished without a trace, all in the vicinity of the abandoned Schneider Ironworks. And now, 2024, the cycle was repeating. Dale and Keith Morrison were just the beginning. Lena knew she was onto something. The pattern was undeniable. Every 50 years the creature emerged, fed for 3 months, then returned to whatever dark place it called home. The Schneider Ironworks was the common thread, the epicenter of the horror. If she could document this, if she could provide proof of a genuine supernatural entity, her career would be reborn. Pulitzer material, bestseller, documentary deals. She allowed herself to dream just for a moment before the reality of her situation reasserted itself. She was alone in a strange town, chasing a story that sounded insane, with no resources and no credibility. One wrong step, one premature revelation of her theories, and she'd be laughed out of town, or worse, committed. But the hunger for redemption burned hotter than fear. Lena had lost everything once. She couldn't bear to lose her last chance at proving she still mattered, that her instincts were still sharp, that she could still uncover the truth when everyone else was content with comfortable lies. She spent the first day in Millbrook establishing her cover. She was writing a book about Appalachian folklore, she'd tell people. A sympathetic angle, celebrating the old stories and the people who kept them alive. It gave her license to ask questions, to probe the collective memory of the community. The local library yielded a treasure trove of microfilm records, local histories, and genealogical documents. The Schneller family had indeed settled the area in 1850, establishing the ironworks on the promise of rich ore deposits in the hills. They'd brought workers from the old country, German immigrants who spoke little English and kept to themselves, maintaining the traditions and superstitions of their homeland. The ironworks had been prosperous for 2 decades, producing pig iron that was shipped down the Potomac to fuel the growing nation's hunger for steel. But in the winter of 1873-74, disaster had struck. The attacks had decimated the workforce. Those who survived spoke of a demon, a flying devil, a creature that hunted from the darkness above. Lena found a translated excerpt from a letter written by Heinrich Schneider himself, dated March 1874. "We have awakened something ancient in the deep places. The miners broke through into a cavern that should not exist, a hollow space beneath the mountain where no hollow space should be. There were structures, arrangements of bone, nests. We sealed the tunnel, but it was too late. It had smelled us. It had tasted our air. Now it hunts, and I fear nothing can stop it until its hunger is satisfied." The letter ended with Schneider announcing his intention to abandon the ironworks and return to Germany. He never made it. According to newspaper accounts, he and his entire family had perished in a house fire 2 weeks after the ironworks closed. The official cause was a faulty chimney, but Lena wondered. Had the creature claimed them anyway despite their flight? Or had someone, something, ensured their silence? She was so engrossed in her research that she barely noticed the library closing around her. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, gently informed her that she needed to leave. As Lena packed up her materials, Mrs. Patterson asked about her project. "Folklore," Lena said, trying to keep her voice casual. "The old German stories, the Schneller Geist specifically." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. She glanced around the empty library as if afraid of being overheard. "You shouldn't dig too deep into that one, dear. Some stories are best left buried." "Why do you say that?" The older woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandmother used to tell us about it, the thing in the woods. She said it sleeps for 50 years, then wakes up hungry, and she said—" Mrs. Patterson paused, seeming to wrestle with herself. "She said the last time it woke up, her brother was one of the ones who didn't come back. 1974. They found his boots, just his boots, standing upright in the middle of a clearing full of blood." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. "Do you think it's real, the Schneller Geist?" Mrs. Patterson straightened up, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. "I think some things are better off being stories, Miss Garner. Good night." Lena left the library with her mind racing. The librarian's fear had been genuine, visceral. This wasn't just superstition. Something in the town's collective memory associated that name with real trauma, real loss. She returned to her motel room and spent hours organizing her notes, creating timelines, mapping the disappearances. The pattern was undeniable. The Schneider Ironworks sat at the center of it all, a dark star exerting gravitational pull on decades of death. She needed to see it. The abandoned ironworks, the tunnels, the cavern that should not exist. If the creature was truly active again, if this 50-year cycle was real, then that was where the answers lay. But first, she needed a guide. Someone who knew the woods, who could navigate the treacherous terrain around the old mine. Someone who might actually believe her, or at least wouldn't report her to the sheriff for asking dangerous questions. Old Man Harkness. The name had come up repeatedly in her research. The town drunk, yes, but also the town historian, the keeper of stories that others forgot or suppressed. He'd been muttering about the thing that ain't natural at the Morrison search site. If anyone would talk to her, it would be him. She found him the next morning, sitting on the porch of his dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook. The old man looked up as she approached, his eyes surprisingly clear despite the whiskey bottle that sat beside his rocking chair. "You're the reporter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lena Garner. I'm investigating the Morrison disappearances." "Not a reporter anymore, though, are ya? I read about you. The fake story. The lawsuit." Harkness cackled, a dry sound like leaves scraping against pavement. "Fallen from grace just like Lucifer. Come to dig up some dirt and climb back up." Lena felt her face flush, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I want the truth, whatever it is." Harkness studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down, fallen angel. I'll tell you about the thing in the woods, but first you should know, once you know you can't unknow. And it knows when you know, that's how it hunts. It smells the fear of the enlightened." Lena sat. She was committed now. Whatever secrets the old man held, she would hear them. Whatever price came with that knowledge, she would pay it. Because the alternative, returning to her empty apartment, to her failed career, to the life she'd built from the ruins of her ambition, was worse than any monster could be. The sky was bleeding color as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of purple and orange that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. Jake Harding stood at the edge of the woods behind his parents' farm, a six-pack of beer dangling from his fingers, his phone buzzing with excited texts from his friends. Tonight was the night, the end of summer bash, his last hurrah before senior year, before college applications, before the adult world closed its jaws around him and refused to let go. His parents thought he was staying at his friend Cody's house. Cody's parents thought he was at Jake's. The alibi was airtight, the plan was perfect, and the clearing in Miller's Hollow was waiting. Jake was 17, invincible, immortal in the way that only teenagers can be. He'd grown up with the stories about the Schneller Geist, same as everyone else in Millbrook. He'd heard the warnings from his grandmother, the ominous hints from teachers, the whispered rumors that circulated whenever someone went missing in the woods. But those were just stories, right? Boogeymen for children, cautionary tales to keep kids from wandering too far from home. The beer was warm, but Jake didn't care. He was chasing a buzz, not a flavor. He'd already finished 2 cans on the walk out, and the alcohol was making his limbs feel loose and light. The path through the woods seemed magical in the twilight, the trees forming cathedral arches overhead, the fallen leaves crunching beneath his boots like the applause of 1,000 invisible spectators. Megan was already at the clearing when he arrived, sitting on the hood of Cody's truck, her face illuminated by the phone screen she was staring at. She looked up as Jake approached, her smile bright and welcoming. "About time, Harding. I thought you chickened out." "Never," Jake said, popping open another beer. "Where are the others?" "Cody and Derek are getting firewood. Shayla went to pee in the bushes." Megan rolled her eyes. Typical. They talked and drank as darkness settled over the clearing like a blanket. Jake found himself watching Megan more than he listened to her words. She was beautiful in the firelight, her blonde hair catching the orange glow, her laughter like music. He'd had a crush on her since freshman year, had never worked up the courage to do anything about it. Tonight, emboldened by beer and the sense of ending that hung over the summer, he decided to change that. Cody and Derek returned with an armful of branches, and Shayla emerged from the tree line, adjusting her clothes. The fire was lit, the music started from a portable speaker, and the night took on the timeless quality of teenage ritual. They were 5 kids in the woods, drinking cheap beer, telling dirty jokes and ghost stories, pretending they weren't terrified of the future. Shayla brought up the Morrisons, as everyone in town had been doing for the past week. "My dad said it was definitely a bear. He said the sheriff is just being cautious by not finding the bodies yet." "Bears don't drag people up trees," Derek said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd read half an article on wilderness survival. "Bears ground cache their prey. This is something else." "Something else like what?" Megan asked, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Like the thing." "The Schneller Geist," Cody intoned in his best horror movie voice. "The thing that comes from above, the dragon of the Germans." They all laughed, but the laughter was forced, uneasy. The darkness beyond the firelight suddenly seemed deeper, more absolute. "My grandma says it's real," Megan whispered. "She says it sleeps for 50 years, then wakes up hungry, and she says this is the year, 2024, 50 years since the last time." "Your grandma also says Elvis is living in her basement," Jake scoffed, but he found himself glancing upward, scanning the treetops for any sign of movement. The branches swayed in a wind he couldn't feel, creating patterns of shadow that seemed almost purposeful. They continued drinking, the alcohol lowering their inhibitions and raising their voices. The conversation shifted to more mundane topics: school, sports, the future that loomed like a cliff's edge. Jake found himself sitting next to Megan, their shoulders touching, their thighs pressed together. When she didn't pull away, he felt his heart racing. It was Shayla who noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" The group fell silent. At first there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves. Then gradually a sound emerged from the darkness above. A mechanical shriek, like metal being torn, like a train breaking, like nothing natural. "What the hell is that?" Cody asked, standing up and peering into the treetops. The sound came again, closer this time, circling. It seemed to move impossibly fast, the Doppler effect making it rise and fall in a way that suggested tremendous speed. "It's probably just an owl or something," Derek said, but his voice cracked. Jake felt fear for the first time that night, real fear that cut through the alcoholic haze. Something was wrong. The atmosphere in the clearing had changed, the air suddenly heavy and charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. "Maybe we should go," Megan said, clutching Jake's arm. "Yeah," Jake agreed, standing up and pulling her with him. "Let's." The attack came from above with the speed of a falcon diving on prey. Something massive blocked out the stars, a shadow that moved faster than thought. Derek had time to scream once before the darkness took him. One moment he was standing by the fire, the next he was gone, lifted into the sky by something that moved with impossible grace. His scream continued for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5, rising higher and higher until it was cut off by a wet, crunching sound. Something warm rained down on the clearing, blood, bits of tissue, fragments of bone. The 4 survivors stood frozen, staring upward where their friend had been. The fire had been extinguished by the downdraft of massive wings, plunging them into darkness. Jake's mind refused to process what he'd seen. It was impossible. Things like that didn't exist. It was a story, a legend, "Run!" Cody screamed, breaking the paralysis. They scattered, each running in a different direction, terror overriding rational thought. Jake grabbed Megan's hand and pulled her toward the path that led back to the farm, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. Behind them, the mechanical shriek sounded again, followed by another scream, Shayla this time, cut off abruptly. Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting Megan to safety, getting back to the lights of the farm, getting away from whatever was hunting them from above. They burst through the tree line and onto the access road that led to the farmhouse. Jake's parents' bedroom light was on. They'd notice if he came in covered in blood and hysterical. They'd call the police. A shadow fell across the road, moving with impossible speed. Jake shoved Megan into the ditch beside the road and threw himself after her, covering her body with his own. Something massive passed overhead, so close he could feel the wind of its passage, smell the coppery scent of fresh blood that clung to it. It circled back and Jake saw it for the first time. The Schneller Geist, the speed ghost, it was real. The creature hovered above the road, its wings spanning at least 20 feet, the membrane stretched between bony fingers that seemed more like the framework of an umbrella than biological structures. Its body was compact, muscular, covered in mottled gray hide that looked like leather cured in blood. But it was the head that Jake would carry to his grave, the massive beak like a raptor's, serrated and sharp, and above it, centered in what should have been a forehead, a single enormous eye. The eye glowed with bioluminescence, a sickly yellow that seemed to pulse with its own light, and it was looking at them. Not past them, not through them, but directly at them with an intelligence that was utterly alien and utterly malevolent. The creature descended, tentacles emerging from beneath its wings. No, not tentacles, Jake realized with mounting horror, but grasping appendages that ended in hooked barbs like fishing lures designed to catch human prey. The barbs gleamed in the moonlight, and Jake saw with perfect clarity the strands of flesh and hair still caught on them. "Don't move," he whispered to Megan, though his voice was barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Don't make a sound." But Megan was beyond hearing. She'd seen the eye, the damn eye, and whatever sanity she'd possessed had fled before its gaze. She began to scream, a high-pitched wail of pure terror that cut through the night like a knife. The Schneller Geist moved. Jake would later try to describe it to the police, to the doctors, to anyone who would listen, but words failed. It didn't fly exactly. It didn't run. It simply arrived. One moment it was hovering 10 feet away, the next it was on top of them, the beak opening to reveal rows of teeth that had no business existing in any natural creature. Jake threw himself to the side, feeling the wind of the beak's passage as it snapped shut where his head had been. He rolled to his feet and ran, not toward the farmhouse but into the woods, the only thought in his mind to draw the creature away from Megan. He heard her scream behind him, heard the wet impact of the beak striking flesh, heard the terrible crunching as the creature fed. He kept running. He couldn't help her. He couldn't help anyone. He could only run and pray that the creature would be satisfied with 4 victims and not hunt for a 5th. But the Schneller Geist was not satisfied. It never was. Jake felt the downdraft of its wings before he saw it, the air pressure forcing him to his knees. He scrambled up, his legs trembling, and looked back. The creature was carrying Megan. Not dead. She was still screaming, her voice raw and broken. But she was suspended in the creature's grasp, held by the barbed hooks that had pierced her shoulders and thighs. The creature rose into the air, Megan dangling beneath it like a fish on a line, and Jake saw with perfect clarity what happened next. The Schneller Geist tightened its grip. The hooks retracted, pulling inward with mechanical precision. Megan's screams reached a pitch that no human throat should be capable of producing, and then her chest cavity collapsed. Her ribs folded inward like the bellows of an accordion, crushed by the pressure of the creature's embrace. Blood poured from her mouth, her nose, her eyes. Her limbs convulsed once, twice, then went limp. The creature let her fall. She hit the ground with a sound like a dropped watermelon, her body landing in an impossible configuration, her spine bent at an angle that suggested every vertebra had been shattered. The Schneller Geist circled overhead once, twice, as if savoring the kill, then descended toward the corpse. Jake didn't see what happened next. He was already running, his mind broken, his sanity fragmenting like glass under a hammer. He ran until his legs gave out, until he collapsed in a drainage ditch miles from anywhere, shaking and sobbing and clawing at his own face as if he could tear out the memory of what he'd witnessed. He was found the next morning by a search party alerted by his parents' report of a missing teen. He was covered in blood, Megan's blood, Derek's blood, the blood of his friends that had rained down on the clearing like a crimson shower. He babbled about the eye, the damn eye, the thing in the sky that wasn't natural. They took him to the hospital, where he was sedated and restrained for his own safety. In the ER, a nurse noticed that his vital signs were crashing, that his breathing had become labored. An X-ray revealed what the creature had done in its final pass. His ribs were crushed, the same pressure that had killed Megan applied in a passing caress, the damage already done even as he ran. He died at 3:47 a.m., his last words a whispered warning. It's awake, it's hungry, it remembers. Megan's body was recovered from the access road, though recovered was a generous term for what remained. The coroner would later note that her injuries were consistent with extreme blunt force trauma combined with penetrating wounds from unknown instruments. The official cause of death was listed as accidental wildlife encounter, probable bear attack. But everyone in Millbrook knew the Schneller Geist had fed, and it was still hungry. The deaths of Jake Harding, Megan Walsh, Shayla Connors, Derek Prentice, and Cody Brennan, 5 teenagers slaughtered in a single night, shattered the tentative peace of Millbrook. The town that had tried to rationalize the Morrison disappearances as a bear attack could no longer maintain the fiction. 5 bodies, or what remained of them, told a story that no amount of official spin could obscure. Sheriff Hargrove held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, his face haggard, his uniform rumpled as if he'd been sleeping in it. "We are investigating a string of tragic incidents involving wildlife," he announced, reading from a prepared statement that had been vetted by state officials. "While these events are deeply concerning, we have no evidence of anything other than normal predatory behavior." The assembled reporters, now dozens of them, drawn by the scent of blood and tragedy, shouted questions. Is it true the bodies were crushed from the inside? What about the reports of something flying? Are the German folklore stories true? Hargrove's hands shook as he folded his statement. "I have no further comment at this time." Lena watched the press conference from the back of the crowd, taking notes that she knew she'd never use in any conventional article. The official narrative was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. But it was a lie that served the town's need for normalcy, for the comforting illusion that the world was rational and predictable. But Lena had seen the crime scene photos. A contact in the sheriff's office, a deputy named Martinez who had children Jake's age and who'd wept while forwarding the images, had sent them to her in the dead of night. What she'd seen had transformed her vague interest into absolute certainty. Megan Walsh's body had been folded. That was the only word for it. Folded like origami, her spine bent in a perfect arc that brought her heels to the back of her head. Her ribs had been crushed inward, the bones driven through her lungs and heart with surgical precision. But the most disturbing detail was the pattern of puncture wounds on her shoulders and thighs, 4 symmetrical holes, 2 uniform to be claws or teeth, arranged like the points of a compass. The autopsy report, also leaked by Martinez, described the damage as consistent with extreme mechanical compression and penetrating trauma from unknown implements. The coroner had circled the word unknown 3 times in red ink. Lena spent the days after the massacre in a frenzy of research and investigation. She interviewed the parents of the dead teenagers, their grief raw and unfiltered, their stories of what had been found at the scene contradicting the official narrative. She spoke with search and rescue volunteers who'd found the bodies, their voices hollow with the trauma of what they'd witnessed. She even managed to corner Sheriff Hargrove in the parking lot of the Millbrook Diner, her recorder hidden in her pocket. "Sheriff, off the record, what do you really think killed those kids?" Hargrove had looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Off the record, I think the world is older and stranger than we pretend, Miss Garner. I think there are things in these woods that were here before us and will be here after we're gone. And I think," he paused, his jaw working, "I think we're in the middle of something that's been happening for a very long time, and I don't know how to stop it." It was the most honest thing she'd heard from anyone in authority since arriving in Millbrook. She spent her evenings with Old Man Harkness, the old-timer's cabin becoming her unofficial headquarters. Harkness had embraced his role as her guide and mentor, filling in the gaps in her research with stories passed down through generations of Appalachian families. "The Germans knew what they'd found," Harkness said, pouring whiskey into 2 mismatched glasses. They were sitting on his porch as darkness gathered, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. "The Schneider mine didn't just dig into the mountain. They dug into something's home, something that was sleeping down there for God knows how long." "What kind of something?" Lena asked, accepting the glass despite her usual abstention. The whiskey burned, grounding her in reality. The Indians had stories about it too before the Germans came. The Shawnee called it the Sky Devourer. The Lenape knew better than to go into those hills, said the mountains had teeth and would bite if you dug too deep. Harkness took a long drink, his Adam's apple bobbing. But the Germans, they were stubborn. They needed that iron. The Civil War was on, demand was high, and the Schneider brothers thought they'd struck it rich. They built that mine right over the creature's lair. And they woke it up. They fed it more like. Harkness's voice dropped to a whisper. The first deaths were miners, cave-ins they said officially, but the bodies that got recovered, they weren't crushed by rock. They were crushed by something that squeezed them, like a python but bigger, stronger, smarter. Lena flipped open her notebook. The newspaper accounts from 1873 say 7 men died in the first wave of attacks. 7 that they found. More went missing, just disappeared into the tunnels. The Schneiders tried everything to stop it, hired hunters, brought in priests, even consulted with some kind of occultist from Baltimore. Nothing worked. The creature just kept taking them, one by one, always at night, always from isolated spots. How did it end? Harkness shrugged his bony shoulders. It didn't really, it just stopped. February 1874, the attack ceased. The Schneiders abandoned the mine, fled back to Germany, but something caught up with them before they could leave. Whole family died in a fire. After that, 50 years of quiet. Then 1924, same pattern, attacks for 3 months, then silence. Then 1974, and now. Lena did the math. It's feeding. That's the pattern. It wakes up every 50 years, hunts for a season, then goes back to sleep. Like a bear hibernating but on a different time scale. Or like something that's following a cycle we don't understand, Harkness corrected. Something that needs to feed but can only feed in certain conditions. Something that's been doing this for centuries, maybe millennia. The Schneider mine, Lena said slowly. The center of it all, the epicenter. If we can find out what happened there, what they uncovered, maybe we can figure out how to stop it. Harkness looked at her with something that might have been pity. You think you can stop it, girl? You think a disgraced reporter and a washed-up old drunk can kill something that's survived for thousands of years? I think we have to try, Lena said, or more people are going to die. They set out for the Schneider Ironworks at dawn the next morning. Harkness driving his battered pickup truck over roads that grew progressively rougher as they climbed into the hills. The old mine was located 10 miles from Millbrook, deep in the forest on the slopes of what the locals called Deadman's Ridge. The road ended at a rusted gate with a no trespassing sign that had faded to illegibility. Harkness parked and produced 2 flashlights from the truck bed, handing one to Lena. From here we walk, about 2 miles through the woods. The hike was grueling, the trail overgrown with decades of neglect. Fallen trees blocked their path, forcing them to climb over or circle around. The undergrowth was dense, thorny, full of hidden rocks that threatened to turn ankles. But Lena barely noticed the physical exertion. Her attention was fixed on the woods around them, on the branches overhead, on every rustle and snap that might indicate pursuit. It hunts at night, Harkness reassured her, though he kept his own eyes on the treetops. Daylight is safe. Relatively safe anyway. What do you mean, relatively? The mine itself, Harkness said. The tunnels. It's always down there even when it's not hunting. The lair, the nest. That's where it sleeps, where it waits. We go down there, we're in its territory. Then why are we going? Because you need to see, Harkness said. You need to understand what we're dealing with, and maybe there's something down there that can help. The Germans were smart men for all their greed. They might have left something behind. A weapon, a weakness, a way to kill the damn thing. They reached the ironworks at midday, the sun high overhead, but even the bright daylight couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The Schneider Ironworks had been abandoned for a century and a half, and nature had done its best to reclaim what human industry had carved from the wilderness. The main processing building had collapsed in on itself, a heap of rusted metal and rotted timber that looked like the skeleton of some great beast. The chimney still stood, a brick finger pointing accusingly at the sky, but the roof was long gone and the walls were draped in ivy that had grown thick as a man's arm. But it was the mine entrance that drew Lena's attention. A stone archway led into the hillside, the iron tracks that had once carried ore carts still visible beneath the accumulated debris. The entrance was partially blocked by a cave-in, but enough of the tunnel remained open to suggest passage was possible. And there was something else, something wrong. Lena approached the archway slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows within. The air that emerged from the tunnel was warm, impossibly warm for an underground space in autumn, and it carried a scent that made her stomach roll, copper and rot and something else, something musky and ancient, the smell of a predator's den. "The main shaft," Harkness said, standing beside her, "goes down about 200 feet, then branches into the working tunnels, but that's not what we want." He led her around the side of the collapsed building, pushing through brush that tore at their clothes. Behind the ironworks, the hillside had been carved away in a series of terraces, each level marked by the remains of support structures and retaining walls. At the bottom of the terraces, partially hidden by a curtain of dead vines, was a second entrance, smaller, more concealed, obviously not part of the official mine complex. "The Germans found this in '73, Harkness said, pulling aside the vines to reveal a narrow passage leading into the earth. "Caved in the main entrance, tried to seal it off, but they never filled the tunnels completely. There's a cavern down there. That's where it came from. That's where it goes back to." Lena shone her flashlight into the passage. The beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness that seemed almost solid. "We're going in there." "You wanted to understand," Harkness said. "This is where understanding lives." They entered the earth. The passage was narrow, forcing them to walk single file. The walls were damp, covered in a slime that gleamed in the flashlight beams. The floor was uneven, treacherous with loose rock and pockets of mud that sucked at their boots. The air grew warmer as they descended, and the scent of rot grew stronger, a physical presence that seemed to coat the inside of Lena's nostrils. After 50 yards, the passage opened into a larger space, not yet the cavern Harkness had described, but a staging area where the miners had stored equipment and ore. Rusted tools lay scattered on the ground, their wooden handles long since rotted away. Crumbling canvas sacks spilled black powder that might have been explosives or might have been something else entirely. "This way," Harkness whispered, and Lena noticed that his voice had dropped to a register barely audible. They continued downward, the tunnel spiraling deeper into the mountain. Lena lost track of time, lost track of distance. Her world narrowed to the beam of her flashlight, the sound of her own breathing, the thud of her heartbeat in her ears. The darkness pressed against her like a physical weight, and she found herself fighting the urge to scream, to run, to claw her way back to the surface and the blessed safety of daylight. Then the tunnel opened into the cavern, and Lena's scream died in her throat. The space was enormous, a cathedral of stone carved by forces she couldn't comprehend. The ceiling was lost in darkness, far beyond the reach of her flashlight. The walls curved away in all directions, smooth as polished glass, bearing no marks of tools or natural erosion. But it was the floor that held her attention, that locked her muscles in paralysis. Bones. Hundreds of them. Thousands, maybe, if the shadows concealed what she feared they did. The cavern floor was carpeted in skeletal remains, arranged in patterns that suggested purpose rather than random accumulation. Here, a circle of deer skulls, each facing inward. There, a spiral of human femurs radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Nests, she realized with mounting horror. The creature had made nests of its victims, had arranged their remains in configurations that served some alien aesthetic. But the bones were old. Centuries old, some of them, bleached white and crumbling to dust. The recent kills, The Morrisons, the teenagers, the others who had vanished in the current cycle, were not here. Those bodies had been consumed elsewhere or disposed of in ways that left no trace. "The Blood Farm," Harkness whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This is where it keeps its larder, where it stores the kills from previous cycles." Lena forced herself to move, to step carefully among the bones. Her flashlight beam swept across the chamber, revealing more and more of the grotesque arrangement. There were human bones mixed with animal, bear, deer, wolf, creatures she couldn't identify. The creature was not particular in its tastes, had never been particular. Anything with blood and meat would serve. "It's been feeding here for centuries," she said, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "Long before the Germans came." "The Indians knew," Harkness said. "They stayed away, sacrificed animals at the edge of the woods to keep it satisfied, to keep it from taking humans. When the Germans broke through into this chamber, they disrupted the balance. The creature woke up hungry, and it's been waking up hungry ever since." Lena moved deeper into the cavern, her flashlight revealing details that made her want to vomit. The walls were stained black, she realized, stained with centuries of blood that had dried and been reapplied, dried and reapplied, layer upon layer forming a crust that crunched underfoot. The smell was overwhelming now, a miasma of decay that seemed to have substance, to press against her face like a damp cloth. And then her light found the pit. It was in the center of the cavern, a depression in the floor perhaps 20 feet across. The sides were smooth, polished, obviously excavated rather than natural, and it was filled with something that gleamed wetly in the flashlight beam. Lena approached it slowly, her revulsion warring with her journalistic instinct to document everything. The pit contained matter, organic matter, decaying flesh, partially digested remains, a soup of dissolution that had been accumulating for centuries. The creature didn't just kill its prey, it processed them here, reduced them to this nutrient broth that it consumed at its leisure. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "Not here," Harkness said, his voice tight with fear. "Jesus has no jurisdiction in this place." Lena was about to respond when she heard it. A sound from above, from the darkness beyond the reach of their lights. A scratching, a shifting, a sound like leather on stone. "It's here," Harkness breathed. "It knows we're here." "I thought you said it hunted at night." "In the open, yes, but this is its lair. This is where it sleeps, where it guards its—" The shriek cut him off. It was the same mechanical scream that had echoed over Miller's Hollow, the same sound that had preceded the slaughter of Jake and his friends. But here in the enclosed space of the cavern, it was magnified, distorted, transformed into something that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. Lena looked up, and for the first time she saw the Schneller Geist in its home. It was perched on a ledge 50 feet above, its wings folded tight against its body, its single eye fixed on them with an intensity that she could feel like a physical pressure. In the dim light of their flashlights, it seemed larger than the description suggested, more massive, more real. The reality of it, the physical existence of this impossible creature, shattered something in Lena's mind, some barrier that had allowed her to treat this as a story, an investigation, a puzzle to be solved. This was not a story. This was death incarnate, ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. "Run," Harkness said, and his voice was surprisingly calm. "Run now and don't look back." "What about you?" "I'll slow it down. I know these tunnels, you don't. Go, girl, go." He shoved her toward the passage they'd entered through, and Lena stumbled, her legs unresponsive, her mind screaming at her body to move. Behind her, she heard Harkness shouting, waving his arms, trying to draw the creature's attention. The Schneller Geist unfolded its wings. The sound was like a sail catching wind, like a flag snapping in a gale, like the pages of a book being torn. It dropped from its perch, not flying but falling, diving, accelerating with impossible speed. Lena ran. She hit the passage at a sprint, her flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. Behind her, she heard Harkness's defiant shout cut off in a wet gurgle, heard the sound of impact, heard the crunching of bone and the tearing of flesh. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. She could only run through the darkness with the creature's shriek echoing in her ears. The passage seemed longer on the return, the turns sharper, the obstacles more treacherous. She tripped over something soft and yielding, realized with horror that it was a body. Not Harkness, too small, must be an old victim from a previous cycle, and scrambled up, her hands slick with the decay that coated everything. Light. She could see light ahead, the gray dimness of the surface world, and she put on a final burst of speed, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. She burst from the passage into the autumn afternoon, the sun still high, the air still crisp and clean. She didn't stop. She ran through the ruins of the ironworks, through the overgrown path, through the woods that had become a nightmare landscape. She ran until her legs gave out, until she collapsed against a tree, gasping, sobbing, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. The Schneller Geist didn't pursue her into the daylight. It had fed, after all. Harkness had been enough. Lena lay there for hours, until the sun began to set, and the realization that night was coming finally penetrated her trauma-shocked mind. She had to move. She had to get back to town, to safety, to lights and people, and the illusion of civilization. She made it to Harkness's truck as the last light was fading from the sky. The keys were still in the ignition. She drove back to Millbrook in a daze, her mind cycling through what she'd seen, what she'd learned, what she still didn't understand. The creature was real. It was ancient. It followed a 50-year cycle of feeding, and it was currently active, hungry, hunting. But there had to be a way to stop it. There had to be. She would find it, or she would die trying. Lena spent 3 days in her motel room, the curtains drawn against the light, her mind churning through the implications of what she'd witnessed. Old man Harkness was dead. She'd seen the creature take him, had heard his final scream echo in the cavern. His sacrifice had bought her time to escape, but it had also left her alone with the knowledge of what they faced. The Schneller Geist, the speed ghost, a creature that had hunted these woods for centuries, perhaps millennia, a predator that followed a cycle of 50-year hibernations, waking to feed for 3 months before returning to its underground lair. A being that was not merely animal but something else, something that arranged its kills in patterns, that nested in bones, that possessed an intelligence alien to human understanding. She couldn't kill it. She knew that now. Not with guns, not with fire, not with any conventional weapon. The creature was too fast, too strong, too ancient. But perhaps she could trap it. Perhaps she could return it to the sleep from which it had awakened. The key was understanding. And in the scattered notes she'd salvaged from Harkness's cabin, in the research she'd compiled from library archives, in the testimony of survivors and witnesses, she found the pattern she needed. The Schneller Geist was drawn to vibration and heat. That was how it hunted, sensing the warmth of living bodies, the movement of prey through the air. It was a creature of the sky, of open spaces that struck from above with the speed of a diving falcon. In the confined tunnels of the mine, its advantages were diminished. It could still fly, still move with terrifying speed, but it was constrained by walls, by ceilings, by the necessity of navigating through narrow passages. And the mine was unstable. The records she'd found, engineering reports from the 1920s, when the state had considered reopening the Schneider ironworks, described the tunnels as critically compromised, subject to spontaneous collapse, unsafe for human habitation. The Germans had dug too deep, had undermined the structural integrity of the mountain, and time had done the rest. If she could lure the creature into the deepest tunnels, trigger a collapse, bury it under tons of rock. It was a desperate plan, probably suicidal, but it was the only plan she had. She spent the next 2 days preparing. She gathered equipment from the hardware store, dynamite sold for clearing stumps, the clerk had explained, though he'd looked at her strangely when she bought 20 sticks, detonators, fuse wire. She rented a pickup truck and drove back to the ironworks under cover of darkness, scouting the terrain, memorizing the layout of the ruins. She found Harkness's remains the next morning. They were near the entrance to the hidden passage, arranged with the same grotesque aesthetic sense she'd seen in the cavern. His bones had been stripped clean, arranged in a spiral pattern that matched the bone nests below. His skull sat atop the pile, facing the rising sun, his empty eye sockets seeming to stare at her with accusation. Lena forced herself to examine the scene clinically, to see the data rather than the horror. The creature had taken him back to its lair, consumed him, then disposed of the remains here at the surface. This was part of its pattern, part of the cycle. The kills were processed in the pit, but the bones were brought up, arranged, displayed. It was territorial behavior. It was marking the boundaries of its hunting ground. She took photographs, her hands steady despite the trembling in her core. These would be her evidence, her proof, the documentation that would validate everything she'd claimed. Even if she died in the attempt to stop the creature, even if the creature survived and continued its cycle, these photos would remain. Someone would find them. Someone would know the truth. She buried what she could of Harkness in a shallow grave at the edge of the woods, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. She said no prayers. She didn't know any that seemed appropriate, but she stood in silence for a long moment, honoring the old man who had given his life so she could escape. "I'll finish this," she promised the grave. "One way or another, I'll finish this." She spent the next week implementing her plan. By day, she worked in the tunnels, planting charges at strategic points, calculating blast patterns that would bring down the ceiling at the right moment. By night, she retreated to the truck, sleeping in fits and starts, waking at every sound, expecting the creature to descend from the darkness at any moment. But the Schneller Geist didn't come for her. Not yet. It was feeding, taking isolated victims from the fringes of town, from the farms and backwoods settlements. The deaths continued, reported in the local news as animal attacks or hiking accidents, but Lena tracked them, mapped them, saw the pattern spreading outward from the ironworks like ripples from a stone thrown in a pond. The 3-month cycle was approaching its end. If the pattern held, the creature would return to its lair soon, would sleep for another 50 years. But Lena couldn't wait, couldn't allow it to escape, to hibernate, to emerge again when she was an old woman or long dead. She had to act now, while it was still active, while it could still be lured. The bait was the problem. The creature was drawn to heat and vibration, yes, but it was also intelligent. It hunted strategically, taking isolated prey, avoiding groups and well-lit areas. It wouldn't simply charge into the tunnels because something warm was moving there. Unless the bait was irresistible. Lena looked at herself in the mirror of the truck's rearview mirror. She was gaunt, hollow-eyed, running on caffeine and determination. She was also, she realized, the perfect bait. A single human, isolated, wounded, vulnerable. The creature had tasted her fear in the cavern, had seen her flee. It knew her scent, knew her weakness. It would come for her if she presented herself in the right way. The plan crystallized. She would enter the tunnels at dusk, move to the deepest chamber she'd explored, the one where the ceiling was most compromised. She would make noise, generate heat, draw the creature down. And when it came, when it entered the kill zone, she would trigger the charges and bury them both. She didn't expect to survive. The explosion that brought down the mountain would likely kill her too, crushed under falling rock or trapped in the dark to suffocate slowly. But that was acceptable. That was, she realized with a strange calm, preferable to returning to the life she'd been living. At least this death would have meaning. At least this death would save others. The night of the trap, she wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, she had no one to write to, but a general explanation, a record of what she'd learned and what she intended to do. She left it on the seat of the truck, weighted down with a stone, along with her notes and photographs. If she failed, if the creature survived and she died, someone would find the truck eventually. Someone would read the letter, know the truth, perhaps continue the fight. She entered the tunnels as the sun was setting, the light fading from orange to purple to black. She carried the detonator in one hand, a road flare in the other. The flare would provide the heat, the light, the signal that would draw the creature down. The descent was easier this time, her familiarity with the passage making the journey quicker. She reached the cavern in 20 minutes, her flashlight revealing the same nightmare landscape of bones and blood-stained walls. The pit in the center still held its soup of decay, the smell still overwhelming, but she forced herself to move through it, to climb the slope on the far side, to reach the tunnel that led to the deepest chamber. This was new territory, unexplored in her previous visit. The passage was narrower here, the ceiling lower, the walls pressing in with claustrophobic intensity. She moved slowly, carefully, placing her feet with precision to avoid the loose rock and debris that could trigger a premature collapse. The chamber at the end was smaller than the main cavern, perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling that arched overhead like the inside of a skull. The rock here was fractured, cracked, held together by nothing more than gravity and time. This was where she would make her stand. She set up the detonator, connecting the wires to the charges she'd planted on her previous visits. The web of explosives surrounded the chamber, embedded in cracks and crevices, ready to bring down tons of stone on command. She tested the circuit twice, 3 times, ensuring that the connection was solid. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. The first sign was the change in air pressure, the sudden gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere, carrying with it the copper scent of fresh blood. Then the sound, that mechanical shriek, distorted by the tunnels into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lena struck the flare. It ignited with a hiss, casting the chamber in harsh red light, raising the temperature by precious degrees. She waved it over her head, creating patterns of shadow that danced on the walls. "Here," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm here, come and get me." The creature came. It descended through the passage like a bullet, folding its wings to fit through the narrow space, unfolding them at the last moment to break its descent. It filled the chamber, its wings spanning from wall to wall, its single eye fixed on Lena with an intensity that made her knees weak. The Schneller Geist was even more terrifying up close. The detail was overwhelming, the texture of its hide like weathered leather soaked in oil, the serrations on its beak, each tooth a precise instrument of death, the tentacles beneath its wings, tipped with the barbed hooks that had pierced Megan Walsh, that had crushed her ribs like dry twigs. It landed on the far side of the chamber, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the stone. It didn't attack immediately. It stared at her, the eye pulsing with that sickly yellow light, and Lena felt the weight of its intelligence pressing against her mind. It knew this was a trap. It could smell the explosives, sense the instability of the rock. But it was also hungry, and the heat of the flare, the vibration of Lena's hammering heart, was irresistible. "Come on," Lena whispered. "Come and get me." The creature lunged. It moved faster than thought, crossing the chamber in an eye blink. Lena threw herself to the side, feeling the wind of its passage, the brush of its wing against her shoulder. The barbed hooks snagged her jacket, tearing fabric, drawing blood, but she rolled clear, scrambling to her feet, backing toward the tunnel entrance. The creature turned, its beak opening to reveal the rows of teeth within. It shrieked again, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, and Lena felt blood trickle from her ears. It lunged again, and again she dodged, her movements desperate, uncoordinated, driven by pure survival instinct. She wasn't going to make it to the tunnel. The creature was too fast, the space too confined. Her only chance was to trigger the charges now, bring down the ceiling while the creature was still in the chamber, hope that the falling rock would crush it before it could escape. Her finger found the detonator button. The creature paused, the eye fixed on the device in her hand, and Lena saw something there, recognition perhaps or calculation. It knew what the detonator was. It understood the threat. It attacked with everything it had. The tentacles shot forward, whipping through the air with the speed of striking snakes. Lena pressed the button. The explosion was simultaneous with the impact. She felt the hooks pierce her side, felt the barbs catch and retract, felt her ribs begin to crack under the pressure. But the ceiling was coming down, tons of rock plummeting from above, and the creature had to choose, finish the kill or escape. It chose escape. The hooks released, tearing flesh, and the creature leaped toward the passage, wings beating desperately. The first rock struck its wing, a glancing blow that sent it spinning. The second rock struck its head, a direct hit that snapped its beak sideways. The third, the fourth, the fifth, a cascade of stone that buried the chamber in dust and darkness. Lena was thrown to the ground by the shockwave, her body pummeled by falling debris. She curled into a ball, protecting her head, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. Something struck her leg, a sharp pain, then numbness. Something else struck her shoulder, driving the breath from her lungs. Then silence. She lay in the darkness, choking on dust, her body a catalog of agony. She couldn't move her left leg, couldn't feel her right arm. Blood was pouring from somewhere, soaking her clothes, pooling beneath her. She was going to die here, buried alive in the dark, her only consolation that she'd taken the creature with her. But had she? In the silence, straining her ears against the ringing in her head, she heard something. Movement, shifting stone. The creature was still alive, still moving, trapped but not dead. Lena found the detonator in the darkness, her fingers closing around the crushed plastic. It was still intact, still functional. She had secondary charges, backups she'd planted in the passage. If the creature was trying to dig its way out, if it was still in the tunnel. She triggered the secondary circuit. The second explosion was smaller, more contained, but it was enough. The passage collapsed completely, sealing the creature behind tons of immovable rock. The sound of falling stone continued for long minutes, an avalanche that buried any hope of escape. Then silence again, true silence. The creature was trapped, entombed, buried under the weight of the mountain it had called home. Lena allowed herself a smile, though it cracked her dust-caked lips and drew fresh blood. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The Schneller Geist would sleep again, not by choice but by necessity, trapped in the dark until the mountain shifted or crumbled or time itself erased its prison. She closed her eyes, accepting the end. She was dying, she knew that now. The blood loss was too severe, the injuries too extensive. She would never see daylight again, never walk out of these tunnels, never tell her story to the world. But she'd saved them. The people of Millbrook, the future victims who would have been taken in the creature's feeding cycle. They would live because she died. That was enough. She drifted into unconsciousness, the darkness welcoming her as a friend. She woke to light. Not the harsh red of the flare, not the artificial beam of a flashlight, but natural light, soft and diffuse, filtering through a gap in the rubble above. And voices, men's voices shouting, calling her name. "Lena Garner, can you hear me?" She tried to answer, but her throat was too dry, too full of dust. She managed a croak, a rasp, barely audible even to her own ears. But it was enough. The voices grew louder, more urgent. The sound of shifting stone, of digging, of rescue. Hands reached through the gap, rough hands, strong hands, pulling at the debris that pinned her. "She's here, I see her, keep digging." They pulled her from the rubble 3 hours later, her body broken but her heart still beating. She was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to repair her shattered leg, her collapsed lung, her internal bleeding. She spent 2 weeks in intensive care, another month in recovery, enduring questions from police, from federal agents, from journalists who smelled a story. She told them everything. The creature, the cavern, the pattern of 50-year cycles. She showed them her photographs, her notes, the letters she'd written in what she'd thought were her final hours. She held nothing back, concealing nothing, caring nothing for how crazy she sounded. The authorities didn't believe her, of course. They cited geological instability, illegal mining operations, reckless behavior that had nearly cost her life. The creature was dismissed as hallucination brought on by trauma, by oxygen deprivation, by psychological breakdown. The deaths in Millbrook were officially attributed to a combination of bear attacks and human predators. But the people of Millbrook knew. They visited her in the hospital, bringing flowers and food, and whispered thanks. The sheriff came, not in his official capacity but as a man who'd seen too much to doubt anymore. He sat by her bed for an hour, saying nothing, just holding her hand. And when she was finally released, when she walked out of the hospital on crutches, her body scarred but healing, the town threw a celebration. Not for her exactly, but for the end of the nightmare. The deaths had stopped. The creature, whatever it was, had been silenced. Lena spent another month in Millbrook, recovering, writing. She compiled her notes into a manuscript, a detailed account of the Schneller Geist and its cycle of feeding. She sent it to publishers, to agents, to anyone who might believe her. The rejections came swiftly, uniformly, too speculative, lacks verifiable evidence, reads as fiction, not suitable for our list. She didn't care. She'd saved lives. That was the only validation she needed. In December, she packed her few belongings and prepared to leave Millbrook. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond escape from the memories that haunted her. She was saying goodbye to the librarian, Mrs. Patterson, when the older woman pressed something into her hand. "My grandmother left this to me," Mrs. Patterson said. "She said it was from the last time, 1974, a man who survived an encounter, who managed to wound the creature before it killed him. He wrote down everything he learned." It was a journal, leather-bound, the pages yellowed with age. Lena opened it at random, reading the spidery handwriting of a man long dead. "It sleeps but does not die," the passage read. "It remembers, it waits. When the mountain shifts, when the rock crumbles, it will wake again, and it will remember those who heard it." Lena felt ice in her veins. She looked up at Mrs. Patterson, but the librarian's eyes were fixed on the middle distance, on something only she could see. "Be careful, Miss Garner," Mrs. Patterson said softly. "Be very careful." Lena drove away from Millbrook at dawn, the rising sun painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. She took the winding road slowly, her legs still stiff, her reflexes still dulled by trauma. She had no plan, no destination, only the need to put distance between herself and the nightmare she'd survived. She passed the turnoff for Deadman's Ridge, for the Schneider Ironworks, for the mass grave where Harkness lay buried. She didn't look. She couldn't look. The past was behind her, the monster was buried, and she was alive. That was enough. Or so she told herself. It was the shadow that warned her. A shadow that moved against the wind, that crossed the sun and plunged the car into darkness for just a moment. She looked up, and her heart stopped. Against the bright disk of the sun, silhouetted like a negative image, was a shape she knew too well. Wings, a hunched body, a single eye that seemed to glow even in the daylight. The Schneller Geist, it had escaped, or had never been trapped at all. The shadow passed and Lena floored the accelerator, the Subaru's engine screaming as she pushed it beyond its limits. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. She could only drive, 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 and pray that the creature was toying with her, that it would let her go, that it would find other prey. In her rearview mirror, she saw the shadow again, keeping pace effortlessly, circling like a shark scenting blood. It was following her. It was hunting her. It remembered. The road curved sharply, and Lena took the turn too fast, the tires screaming, the car sliding toward the guardrail and the 1,000-foot drop beyond. She corrected barely, her heart hammering, her hands shaking. When she dared to look back, the shadow was gone. She drove until she ran out of gas, until she stumbled into a gas station in some town she'd never heard of, until she collapsed in the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. The creature was still out there. It was free, and it knew her scent. She spent the next year looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, waking from nightmares in which the eye consumed the world. She moved from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. She changed her name, her appearance, her entire identity. But she never stopped researching, never stopped trying to understand what the creature was, where it had come from, how it could be truly destroyed. The journal Mrs. Patterson had given her became her Bible, its pages worn from constant handling. It sleeps but does not die, it remembers. She would remember too, and she would be ready when the time came. When the mountains shifted, when the rock crumbled, when the Schneller Geist emerged again to feed. Next time she would be prepared. Next time she would have a plan that didn't rely on luck, on sacrifice, on desperate gambits in the dark. Next time she would end it. The trail camera was positioned on a remote hiking trail in the Shenandoah Valley, 40 miles from Millbrook, placed by a graduate student studying black bear populations. It was triggered by motion sensors, capturing thousands of images of deer, foxes, hikers, the occasional curious bear. On the night of March 15th, it captured something else. The sequence began with a lone hiker, a young man in his 20s, trekking the trail with a headlamp bobbing in the darkness. He was moving quickly, as if trying to reach his destination before full dark. The camera captured him at 10-yard intervals, his form growing larger, more detailed as he approached the lens. Then the shadow fell. It descended from above, faster than the camera's shutter could capture clearly. The hiker looked up, his mouth opening in a scream that the image couldn't record. The next frame showed him lifted off the ground, his body suspended in the beam of his own headlamp, which had fallen and now pointed upward. The frame after that showed the Schneller Geist in full view, its wings spread, its beak open, its single eye fixed on the camera with an awareness that transcended the medium. The final frame, captured seconds later as the creature turned toward the lens, showed nothing but the eye. The pupil-less, glowing, malevolent eye, staring directly into the camera as if staring through it, into the viewer, into the world. The hiker was never found. His backpack was discovered 3 days later, sitting upright in the middle of the trail, soaked in blood. The graduate student who reviewed the footage quit her program the next day. She moved to the city, refused to speak of what she'd seen, spent her nights in brightly lit rooms with the television on. But the images survived. They were uploaded to a cloud server, archived, forgotten. They waited in the dark like the creature itself, patient and eternal. The cycle continued. The Schneller Geist still hunted. And somewhere, in a cheap apartment in a city far from the mountains, Lena Garner saw the images on her laptop screen and knew. It was still awake. It was still hungry. And it would remember her face until the end of time. 5 years passed. Lena Garner, now living under the name Sarah Bennett, had established a quiet life in Burlington, Vermont, working remotely as a freelance editor for academic journals. The work was tedious, the pay modest, but it kept her mind occupied and her bank account solvent. More importantly, it kept her away from windows after dark, away from open spaces, away from anything that reminded her of what hunted the skies. She had not forgotten. She would never forget. The eye was always there, lurking at the edge of her vision, staring up at her from the reflection of her computer screen, watching her from the shadows between streetlights. She took medication for the nightmares, for the panic attacks, for the constant vigilance that had become her default state. The doctors called it PTSD, trauma response, survivor's guilt. They didn't know the half of it. But she had kept researching. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep wouldn't come and the memories threatened to overwhelm her, she scoured the internet for any mention of similar creatures, similar patterns. She found them. Cryptid sightings from around the world, folklore that transcended cultures and continents, stories of winged terrors that fed on human flesh. In West Virginia, there were reports of the Mothman, a winged entity that had terrorized Point Pleasant in the 1960s. But the Mothman was passive, ominous, a harbinger rather than a predator. The Schneller Geist was something else entirely, hungry, active, murderous. In the Philippines, the Nightingale split its body in half to fly and feed on the unborn. In Indonesia, the Palasic stole infants from their cradles. In European folklore, the Alp sat on sleepers' chests, causing nightmares and draining life force. But none of them matched perfectly. The Schneller Geist was unique, or at least uniquely documented. Its 50-year cycle, its single eye, its mechanical shriek, its preference for crushing prey mid-flight. These were specific signatures that didn't appear in other accounts. Lena began to suspect that the creature was not a biological entity at all, not in any conventional sense. Its behavior suggested something older, something that operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. The 50-year cycle wasn't biological necessity. It was ritual, tradition, a pattern as much spiritual as physical. She found references in obscure German texts to creatures called Alpdrucken, nightmare spirits that fed on fear and flesh. The Alpdrucken were said to be created by dark magic, by pacts with ancient powers, by the breaking of natural laws. They were immortal but not invincible, bound by rules and patterns that could be exploited by those who understood them. The Schneider brothers, she realized, had not simply dug into the creature's lair. They had released it. The cavern that should not exist, that Heinrich Schneider had described in his letter, it had been a prison, a containment, a binding that had held the creature for centuries before the miners broke through. The Germans had known. The miners who'd died first, the ones who'd been crushed and consumed, they had been sacrifices, blood offerings to appease the thing they'd unleashed. When the offerings stopped, when the Schneiders tried to flee, the creature had hunted them down. The house fire that killed them hadn't been an accident. It had been execution. Lena spent 3 years building her theory, cross-referencing sources, tracing patterns through history. She discovered that similar cycles had occurred elsewhere, in the Black Forest of Germany in the 1500s, in the Carpathian Mountains in the 1700s, in the forests of Maine in the early 1900s. Always the same pattern: 50 years of quiet, then 3 months of slaughter, then silence again. The creatures, she theorized there were more than one, perhaps a species or a family of related entities, migrated, following their feeding cycles across the globe. The one she'd encountered in Maryland was just one of many, moving through the world like a storm through the seasons. But she also found references to methods of binding, of containing, of destroying them. Ancient rites, most lost to time, that had been developed by those who'd suffered under the creature's predation. Symbols carved in stone, chants spoken in dead languages, sacrifices of specific types. The key, she discovered, was the eye. The single eye was not just a sensory organ. It was the creature's anchor to the physical world, its connection to the reality that sustained it. The legend spoke of the eye that sees but is blind, a paradox that suggested the creature's vision operated on principles alien to human optics. It saw heat, yes, and vibration and fear. But it also saw something else, life force, perhaps, or the spark that made humans human. Destroy the eye, the legend suggested, and you destroyed the creature. Not temporarily, not until it recovered, but permanently. The eye was the source of its immortality, the reservoir of its ancient power. Lena began to plan. She accumulated resources, weapons, explosives, scientific equipment. She established a network of contacts in the cryptozoology and occult communities, people who believed her stories because they had stories of their own. She learned to fight, to shoot, to move silently through dark places. She transformed herself from a journalist into a soldier, from a victim into a hunter. And she waited. The creature would emerge again, not from the same location but somewhere else, following the pattern of its migration. She tracked reports, monitored databases, watched for the signs: unexplained disappearances, crushed bodies, blood trails leading upward. She knew it was still active, still feeding, even if its cycles had shifted away from the Appalachian region. In 2029, her vigilance was rewarded. Reports began filtering out of rural Pennsylvania, a small town called Ashford that sat in the shadow of the Poconos. 5 disappearances in 2 weeks, all hikers and outdoor enthusiasts, all vanishing from trails that had been safe for generations. The official story was bear attacks, same as always, but Lena knew. She packed her equipment and drove south. Ashford was smaller than Millbrook, poorer, more isolated. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where strangers were noticed and mistrusted. Lena established her cover quickly. She was a nature photographer, documenting the fall foliage for a travel magazine. It was a plausible story, and it gave her license to spend her days in the woods. The pattern was the same. The disappearances clustered around a specific location. This time, an abandoned slate quarry that had operated in the late 1800s. German immigrants again, she discovered. The quarry had been owned by the Mueller family, who had closed operations abruptly in 1874 after a series of accidents that had killed 12 workers. She found the lair on her 3rd day of searching. Not underground this time. The quarry was too shallow, the bedrock too close to the surface. Instead, the creature had claimed the abandoned processing plant, a massive structure of rusted metal and broken glass that sat at the quarry's edge like a rotting carcass. The smell hit her first, even from 100 yards away, the same copper and rot scent she'd encountered at the Schneider Ironworks, the same miasma of decay that marked the creature's territory. She approached carefully, her rifle loaded with armor-piercing rounds, her pack heavy with explosives and the special weapon she'd commissioned based on her research. It was a spear, 5 feet long, with a head forged from meteoric iron according to ancient specifications. The iron had been heated and cooled in a specific sequence, treated with herbs and minerals that were supposed to disrupt the creature's connection to the physical world. The tip had been ground to a monomolecular edge, capable of piercing steel, and coated with a neurotoxin derived from cone snail venom. It was her best chance, her only chance. She entered the processing plant as the sun was setting, her flashlight cutting through the dust-choked air. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed scaffolding, the floor strewn with debris that crunched underfoot. She moved slowly, carefully, every sense alert for the slightest sound. The creature was here. She could feel it, the same way she'd felt it in the cavern 5 years ago, a pressure in the air, a wrongness in the world. It was sleeping, she thought, or resting, conserving its energy for the night's hunt. She had to strike before it woke, before it sensed her presence. She found it in the deepest chamber of the plant, a massive open space that had once housed ore crushers. It was hanging from the ceiling, wrapped in its wings like a massive bat, its eye closed, its breathing slow and rhythmic. Lena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for, training for, dreaming of. The chance for revenge, for redemption, for the end of the nightmare that had consumed her life. She raised the spear, sighting along its length, aiming for the eye. The creature's face was exposed, the massive orb vulnerable and still. One throw, one strike, and it would be over. Her finger tightened on the shaft. The eye opened. The creature had been awake all along, waiting, watching, sensing her approach through means she couldn't comprehend. The eye fixed on her with that same malevolent intelligence, that same hunger that had consumed her dreams for 5 years. It dropped from the ceiling, unfolding its wings with a sound like thunder, filling the chamber with its presence. It didn't attack immediately. It stared at her, the eye pulsing, and Lena felt her resolve wavering. She was small, weak, human. It was ancient, powerful, beyond her ability to harm. But she had prepared, she had trained, she had not come here to die. She threw the spear. It was a perfect throw, years of practice culminating in a single moment of precision. The spear traveled straight and true, aimed directly at the creature's eye. The Schneller Geist moved. Not away, but toward, diving with impossible speed. The spear struck not the eye but the beak, glancing off the serrated metal with a shower of sparks. The creature shrieked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, and Lena felt her ears bleed. It was on her before she could react, its tentacles whipping out, the barbed hooks catching her jacket, her skin, her flesh. She felt the barbs bite deep, felt the hooks retract, felt her body lifted from the ground. But she had anticipated this. In her pack she'd carried a device, a modified taser delivering a massive electrical charge. She triggered it now, pressing the contacts against the tentacle that held her. The electricity surged through the creature's body, and it shrieked again, this time in pain rather than anger. The tentacle spasmed, releasing her, and she fell to the ground, rolling to her feet, scrambling for cover. The creature recovered quickly, its eye blazing with fury. It had never been hurt before, Lena realized. In all its centuries of existence, no one had ever fought back, had ever managed to inflict pain. She had made it angry. It attacked with everything it had, diving and striking, its beak snapping inches from her face. She dodged barely, feeling the wind of its passage. She ran through the maze of machinery, the creature in pursuit, its shrieks echoing off the metal walls. She led it to the trap she'd prepared, a section of floor she'd weakened, supported only by a few strategically placed charges. She'd intended to lure it there, trigger the explosives, drop it into the level below where more explosives waited. But it was faster than she'd anticipated. It caught her at the edge of the trap, its tentacles wrapping around her waist, its hooks finding purchase in her ribs. She felt the pressure building, felt her bones beginning to crack, and knew she had seconds to live. She triggered the charges. The explosion was massive, the floor collapsing beneath them, sending them both plummeting into the darkness below. The creature shrieked, releasing her, flapping its wings desperately to arrest its fall. Lena fell free, tumbling through space, hitting something hard, something that drove the breath from her lungs. She lay in the rubble, broken and bleeding, watching as the creature struggled to rise. The fall had hurt it. She could see that, see the way its wings drooped, the way its movements were sluggish. But it wasn't dead. It was never dead. It approached her slowly, limping, the eye fixed on her with a hatred that transcended mere predation. This was personal now. She had heard it. It would make her suffer. Lena reached for her final weapon. The pistol, loaded with the same meteoric iron bullets she'd had specially made. She raised it with trembling hands, sighting on the eye, the only target that mattered. The creature paused. It saw the gun, understood the threat. For a moment they stared at each other across the rubble, predator and prey, ancient and modern, monster and human. Lena fired. The shot was wild, driven by pain and desperation. It struck the creature's shoulder, doing no damage, merely angering it further. It lunged, beak open, and Lena closed her eyes, waiting for the end. The second shot came from somewhere else. She heard the crack of the rifle, heard the creature shriek in surprise and pain. She opened her eyes to see the creature spinning, the eyes searching for this new threat. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, middle-aged, dressed in hunting gear, holding a rifle with professional competence. She fired again, the shot striking the creature's wing, tearing through the membrane. "Get down!" the woman shouted, and Lena complied, flattening herself against the rubble. The woman emptied her magazine into the creature, each shot carefully placed, targeting the wings, the joints, the vulnerable spots. The creature screamed and thrashed, trying to rise, trying to escape, but the wounds were too severe, the damage too extensive. It collapsed, finally, its massive body crashing to the ground, the eye dimming, fading, dying. The woman approached cautiously, rifle ready, and placed one final shot directly into the center of the eye. The light went out, the creature went still. For the first time in its existence, the Schneller Geist was dead. Lena lay in the rubble, crying and laughing and bleeding, as the woman knelt beside her. "My grandmother told me about this thing," the woman said, her voice calm despite the madness of what they'd just done. "She was one of the ones who got away in '74. She spent her whole life preparing for its return." "You killed it," Lena whispered, not quite believing it. "We killed it," the woman corrected. "You weakened it, I finished it." She smiled, a grim expression that didn't reach her eyes. "My name is Grace, Grace Patterson. My grandmother was the librarian in Millbrook." Lena laughed, the sound turning into a cough into blood. "Mrs. Patterson. She left me everything. The journal, the research, the weapons. She knew this day would come." Lena felt consciousness fading, the pain overwhelming her. "Is it really dead?" Grace looked at the creature's body, at the ruined eye, at the stillness that had replaced the terrible vitality. "It's dead," she confirmed. "Finally, truly dead." Lena smiled as the darkness took her. It was over. After 5 years of terror, of running, of fighting, it was over. The Schneller Geist was gone, destroyed, ended. She could rest. The authorities never found the body. Grace had moved it, hidden it, disposed of it in ways that ensured it would never be discovered. The official story was that an abandoned quarry had collapsed, killing a trespasser. Lena Garner's remains were never identified. But in the world of those who knew, in the hidden networks of cryptid hunters and occult researchers, the story spread. The Schneller Geist was dead. One of the ancient predators had been slain. Grace Patterson became a legend in those circles, the woman who'd killed a creature that had terrorized Appalachia for centuries. She spent the rest of her life hunting others of its kind, tracking the migration patterns, preparing for the next cycle. And in a small cemetery in Vermont, beneath a stone marked Sarah Bennett, a woman who had once been Lena Garner lay in eternal rest. She had found her redemption, her purpose, her ending. The nightmare was over. But in the mountains, in the deep places where the old things still slept, other eyes opened. Other creatures stirred. The world was old and full of terrors, and the death of one monster was merely the prelude to the awakening of others. The cycle continued. The hunting never ended. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something watched and waited, and remembered the woman who had dared to fight back. The hungry dark. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the circle of teenagers in dim red light that made their faces look like masks. Old Thomas Begay stirred the ashes with a stick, his wrinkled face unreadable in the flickering glow. He was 73, the last of the traditional medicine men in this part of the reservation, and he had lived long enough to know that some warnings should be spoken aloud, even if no one would believe them. "When the ice hearted one meets the skin thief," he said, his voice dry as desert wind, "the land will bleed." The teenagers exchanged glances, some nervous, some mocking. They were the children of the modern world, more comfortable with cell phones than with ancient prophecies. But they had come to old Thomas's fire because the disappearances had frightened them, because the grown-ups weren't telling them the truth, because they needed to hear something that made sense. "What do you mean?" asked Dinah Yazzie, the youngest at 15, her eyes wide and earnest. "What ice-hearted one? What skin thief?" Old Thomas looked at her and his expression softened. "You know the stories, little one. You know them better than you pretend." Before Dinah could answer, the horses screamed. The sound was wrong. Not the whinny of fear, not the cry of pain, but something deeper, something that spoke of violation at the most fundamental level. The 6 horses tied at the edge of the clearing were screaming in unison, their voices rising into a harmony of pure terror. Old Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving faster than his age should have allowed. "Inside!" he shouted. "Now the Hogan!" The teenagers scrambled up, their teenage skepticism forgotten in the face of that terrible sound. They ran for the traditional Navajo dwelling that old Thomas called home, a circular structure of logs and mud that had stood on this spot for 50 years. They almost made it. The first horse went down with a sound like a wet sheet tearing. The teenagers turned, despite themselves, drawn by the compulsion to witness what should never be seen. In the moonlight, something moved among the horses. It was fast, terribly fast, a blur of pale flesh and darker shadows. The horses were dying not from wounds, not from any injury that made sense, but from being unmade. Their bodies seemed to fold in on themselves, their flesh separating from bone with surgical precision, their hides peeling away like fruit rinds. And there was something there in the midst of the carnage, something tall and thin and wrong. "Don't look," old Thomas screamed, grabbing Dine and dragging her toward the hogan. "Don't look at it. If you look, it knows you. It marks you." They stumbled through the doorway, old Thomas slamming the heavy wooden door behind them, muttering prayers in Navajo that were older than the reservation, older than the United States, older than the arrival of Europeans on this continent. Outside, the screaming continued, the horses dying by inches, being torn apart by something that didn't eat, didn't consume, just destroyed. When silence finally fell, it was worse than the screaming. Old Thomas sat by the door, his prayer bundle clutched to his chest, his face gray with fear. "The skin thief," he whispered. "It's here, it's awake." But that wasn't all. As the teenagers huddled together in the darkness, they heard something else. A sound like wind through ice, like the cracking of frozen lakes, like the breathing of something that had never been warm. It was coming from the east, from the direction of the mountains, from the high country where snow lingered even in summer. Two of them, old Thomas breathed, and his voice was the sound of defeat. The prophecy, it's coming true. Elan Yazzie had been a forest ranger for 12 years, patrolling the timberlands and wilderness areas that bordered the Navajo Nation. He knew every trail, every water source, every seasonal migration pattern of the wildlife that called this harsh country home. He had dealt with poachers, with wildfires, with lost hikers and aggressive bears, and everything else the backcountry could throw at him. But he had never seen anything like the carcasses he found on the morning of August 15th. They were deer, 6 of them, arranged in a line along a ridgeline that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Their bodies were intact, no sign of predation, no indication of disease, but they were frozen. Frozen solid despite the summer heat, their flesh glazed with hoarfrost that gleamed in the morning sun. Elan approached them carefully, his hand on his sidearm. This was wrong. This was impossible. The temperature had been in the 70s yesterday, and these deer hadn't been here then. He would have seen them from the trail, which meant they had been placed here, frozen, sometime in the night. He knelt beside the nearest carcass, his breath misting in the cold air that surrounded the bodies. It was freezing here, actually freezing despite the surrounding warmth. He could see his breath, could feel the chill seeping through his uniform. The deer's eyes were open, frozen wide, and there was something in them that made Elan look away. Fear, pure, abject terror preserved in ice. He called it in, describing the scene to his supervisor at the district office. The response was predictable. Disbelief, suggestions that he was playing a prank, finally grudging acceptance that something unusual was happening, and a promise to send a team to investigate. Elan didn't wait. He documented the scene with his camera, taking photos from every angle, capturing the impossibility of frozen deer in August. Then he noticed the tracks. They were humanoid. Not human, but humanoid, 2 legs, but the proportions were wrong, the feet too long, the stride too wide. And there were claws, 5 of them on each foot, digging into the soil with enough force to leave gouges. The tracks led away from the deer down the ridge toward the valley. Elan followed them for 100 yards before they simply stopped. Not faded, not turned, but stopped, as if whatever had made them had ceased to exist. He returned to his patrol truck with his mind churning. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone who grew up on the reservation had heard them. The stories of the Wendigo, the ice-hearted spirit that possessed men and turned them into monsters. The stories of the Skinwalkers, witches who wore the skins of animals and people to take their shapes. But he had never believed them. He had gone to college in Flagstaff, had studied forestry and wildlife management, had learned the scientific explanations for everything. He was a modern man, a rational man. He didn't believe in monsters. But he couldn't explain frozen deer. He couldn't explain tracks that stopped in mid-stride. And he couldn't explain the fear that was growing in his gut, the primitive certainty that something was wrong in a way that went beyond the physical world. He drove back to the ranger station with the photos on his camera, and the tracks burned into his memory. The second body was found 3 days later. His name was Charlie Tallhorse, a hunter who had gone into the woods behind his property and never come back. His wife found him at dawn, frozen solid in their backyard, his chest burst open, the cavity empty of organs. But it wasn't the wounds that made the tribal police call Elan. It was the hoarfrost. The same glaze of ice that had covered the deer now covered Charlie's body, and the ground around him for 20 feet in every direction was frozen hard as concrete. Elan stood at the edge of the scene, watching as the tribal investigators did their work. He knew Charlie had gone to school with him, had hunted with him in their teenage years. He had been a good man, a kind man, a man who didn't deserve to die like this. "You saw the deer," said a voice beside him. Elan turned to find Mary Bitsui, the tribal police captain, watching him with eyes that were too knowing. She was in her 50s, a lifer in law enforcement, the kind of woman who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "Yeah," Elan admitted, "same ice, same wrongness." "We've had reports from other communities," Mary said quietly. "Livestock frozen in their pastures, a dog found in the road frozen solid, still in the middle of a stride. Something's happening, Elan, something that doesn't fit any natural explanation." "You think it's—" Elan hesitated, unwilling to speak the word aloud. "I think the elders know more than they're saying. I think there are patterns here that match old stories, and I think—" She paused, looking around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I think we need to take this seriously, even if it sounds crazy." "The Wendigo," Elan said. "Or something like it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Charlie Tallhorse's body was loaded into the medical examiner's van. The ice had begun to melt in the morning sun, leaving puddles that steamed in the heat. The normal world was reasserting itself, but the memory of the impossible remained. "There's something else," Mary said. "Something I haven't told anyone yet. We found tracks near the body. Not the ones you saw by the deer, different ones. These were boot prints, human boot prints, but wrong." "Wrong how?" "They were backwards. The left shoe on the right foot, the right on the left. And they were the only tracks. No approach, no retreat. Just those prints appearing from nowhere, walking around the body, then disappearing." Elan felt ice in his veins that had nothing to do with the frost around Charlie's corpse. "Skinwalker," he whispered. "That's what my grandmother would say." The attacks escalated over the next week. 3 more bodies were found, all frozen, all with their chests burst open, hearts removed. The tribal council called an emergency meeting, closed to outsiders, and Elan was invited to attend because of his knowledge of the backcountry, his discovery of the deer, his connection to the investigation. The council chamber was filled with elders, medicine men and women, tribal officials. The atmosphere was heavy with fear and with something else, expectation, as if they had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but prepared for it. "The stories are true," said Thomas Begay, the same old man who had warned the teenagers by the fire. He stood at the center of the circle, his prayer bundle in his hands. "The ice-hearted one has awakened. The Wendigo walks among us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elan raised his hand. "With respect, Thomas, how do we know? How do we know this isn't just something else, something natural?" "Because I've seen it," Thomas said simply. 5 nights ago it came to my fire. It killed my horses, though it didn't eat them. The Wendigo doesn't eat. It only hungers. It feeds on the cold, on the fear, on the life it takes. The flesh is incidental." "And the Skinwalker?" Mary Bitsui asked. "The backward tracks?" Thomas's face darkened. "That is worse. The Skinwalker is not a spirit but a witch, a human who has chosen evil over good, who has killed a family member to gain power. The Skinwalker wears the skin of animals, of people, taking their shapes, their voices, their memories. It is intelligent, cunning, patient. Where the Wendigo is hunger, the Skinwalker is malice." "Why are they here?" someone asked. "Why now?" Thomas closed his eyes, reciting from memory words that had been passed down for generations. "When the ice-hearted one meets the skin thief, the land will bleed. They are ancient enemies, these two. The Wendigo cannot abide the Skinwalker's stolen warmth, and the Skinwalker cannot tolerate the Wendigo's endless cold. They have fought before, many times, and always the land suffers." "How do we stop them?" Elon asked. "We cannot," Thomas said. "Not alone. They are too powerful, too ancient, but we can contain them, bind them, trap them together so that they destroy each other, or at least neutralize each other." "How?" Thomas opened his eyes, and they were filled with a terrible knowledge. "The kiva, the ceremonial chamber at the center of the reservation, where our ancestors performed the most sacred rites. It was built to contain powerful spirits, to hold them until they could be dealt with properly. If we can lure both creatures there, trap them inside, seal the entrance." "They'll just dig their way out," someone objected. "Or fly, or—" "The kiva is not just a hole in the ground. It is sacred space, blessed by generations of medicine men and women. It holds power of its own. If both creatures are inside, their own natures will work against them. The Wendigo's ice will clash with the Skinwalker's stolen heat, and they will be locked in eternal struggle." "That's a lot of ifs," Mary said. "It is the only way," Thomas replied. "Unless you would rather wait for them to kill everyone on the reservation, one by one, night by night." The council was silent. Elon looked around the room, seeing the fear in every face, the desperate hope that this old man's plan might work. He thought of Charlie Tallhorse, frozen in his own backyard. He thought of the deer on the ridge, arranged like offerings. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll help you lure them, I'll help you trap them." Thomas nodded, and for the first time, Elon saw something like relief in the old man's eyes. "Then prepare yourself, Ranger Yazzie. The hunt begins tomorrow." The Skinwalker struck first. It came to the Hogan of the Benelli family on the 3rd night after the council meeting. The Benellis were asleep, 7 people in 3 rooms, secure in their home and their locks and their faith that evil couldn't touch them. The Skinwalker didn't need doors. It came through the window, sliding through the gap like smoke, wearing the shape of a coyote but moving with human intelligence. It went to the children's room first. Little Marie Benelli woke to find something standing over her bed, something that wore her mother's face but had too many teeth, something that smiled at her with eyes that held no warmth. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," it said in her mother's voice. "Everything's fine." Marie screamed. The scream woke the house, but it was too late. The Skinwalker moved with supernatural speed, slicing through flesh with claws that weren't quite claws, breaking bones with strength that wasn't quite natural. By the time Joe Benelli reached his daughter's room with his shotgun, 3 of his children were dead, their skins hanging from the Skinwalker's frame like a coat of stolen flesh. He fired. The buckshot struck the creature in the chest, knocking it back, but it didn't fall. It laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and lunged. Joe Benelli died with his finger still on the trigger, his throat torn out, his eyes wide with the knowledge of what had killed him. But the gunshot had been heard. Neighbors were coming, lights were turning on, the night was filling with human activity. The Skinwalker gathered its stolen skins, the children, beautiful children, their faces still recognizable on the wrinkled flesh it wore, and slipped away into the darkness. It was halfway to its lair when the cold hit. The Wendigo didn't announce itself. It didn't roar or shriek or give any warning. It simply descended from the ridgeline above, a 15-foot monstrosity of pale flesh and cracking ice, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in claws of frozen blood. The Skinwalker stopped, its stolen faces twisting in recognition and rage. It knew this enemy. They had fought before, across centuries, across continents. They were antithesis made flesh. "Ice Heart," the Skinwalker hissed, using a voice that was a chorus of its victims. "This is not your territory." "All territory is mine," the Wendigo replied, its voice like the wind across a frozen lake. "The cold goes where it wills, and I smell stolen warmth. I smell flesh that should be frozen. I smell prey." The Skinwalker dropped the children's skins, abandoning its disguise. Its true form emerged, a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal, with joints that bent wrong, with a face that was almost human but stretched too wide, with fingers that ended in surgical scalpels rather than claws. "You want them," the Skinwalker taunted. "Come and take them." The Wendigo charged. It moved with terrifying speed, covering the distance in seconds, its massive arms reaching out to grab, to crush, to freeze. The Skinwalker dodged, rolling under the swiping claws, coming up behind the monster and slashing at the tendons of its legs. The Wendigo felt nothing. It was cold itself, cold beyond pain, cold beyond sensation. It turned, sweeping one massive arm in a backhand that caught the Skinwalker in the chest and sent it flying. The Skinwalker hit a boulder with enough force to shatter a human spine. It slid down, laughing, its broken bones already knitting back together. "You hit like winter," it mocked. "Slow, predictable, endless." "And you die like summer," the Wendigo rumbled. "All flash and no depth." They clashed again, the Wendigo's bulk against the Skinwalker's speed. Claws of ice met scalpels of bone. The Skinwalker danced around the slower monster, slicing shallow cuts that healed almost instantly, freezing as soon as they were made. The Wendigo roared, a sound that cracked the ice in a nearby stream, and grabbed for the Skinwalker. This time it caught hold, massive fingers wrapping around the Skinwalker's torso. The cold intensified, hoarfrost spreading from the point of contact, trying to freeze the Skinwalker solid. But the Skinwalker was already changing, already adapting. It grew fur, thick and warm, insulating itself against the cold. It twisted, snake-like, in the Wendigo's grip and bit down with teeth that were part wolf, part bear, part things that had no name. The Wendigo felt something like pain. It dropped the Skinwalker and they separated, circling each other in the moonlight, each looking for advantage. "We could share," the Skinwalker suggested, its voice reasonable despite the madness in its eyes. "Plenty of prey. You take the cold places, I take the warm. No need for conflict." "I am conflict," the Wendigo replied. "I am winter and death and the end of all warmth. You are an abomination, a thing that wears the shapes of the living. I will freeze you and break you and scatter your pieces across the ice." "Then come, Ice Heart, try." They charged again, and this time they didn't hold back. The clearing became a battlefield of clashing elements, the Wendigo's cold meeting the Skinwalker's stolen heat. Steam rose where they touched, obscuring their forms, making the fight surreal and terrible to witness. Elan Yazi watched from the ridgeline above, hidden in the rocks, his rifle cold in his hands. He had followed the sound of the battle, had arrived just in time to see the creatures clash. Now he watched, paralyzed by awe and terror, as two monsters tore at each other with hatred that transcended reason. He should run, he knew that. He should run and keep running and never look back. But he also knew that this was his chance. This was the moment Thomas had spoken of, the creatures distracted, focused on each other, vulnerable in their rage. If he could lure them to the kiva now, while they were fighting, while they weren't paying attention to anything else. He moved. It was the worst decision of his life. The Skinwalker smelled him first. Even in the midst of battle, its senses were attuned to human fear, human warmth, human life. It turned its head, those too many teeth gleaming, and saw the ranger on the ridge. "Prey," it hissed. The Wendigo followed its gaze. Fresh prey, not frozen, not stolen, living. They stopped fighting. They turned together, united in their hunger, and looked at Elan Yazzie. He ran. He ran like he had never run before, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, his mind screaming at him to move, move, move. Behind him, he heard them coming, the Skinwalker's light footsteps, the Wendigo's heavy crashing, both fast, both relentless. He had the truck. He had to reach the truck. The keys were in his pocket, the engine would start, he could outrun them, he could. The Skinwalker landed in front of him, having run along the ride line and dropped down. It smiled, and it was wearing Charlie Tallhorse's face. "Ranger," it said in Charlie's voice, "going somewhere." Elan fired his rifle. The shot took the Skinwalker in the shoulder, spinning it around. Elan kept running past it, toward the truck, but then the cold hit him, the bone-deep cold that froze his blood and stopped his breath. The Wendigo emerged from the trees, blocking his path. It reached for him, massive fingers spreading, and Elan knew that if those fingers touched him, he would freeze, would become another frozen statue in this nightmare landscape. He dove sideways, rolling, coming up with his knife drawn. It was laughable, a pocket knife against these things, but it was all he had. The Skinwalker recovered, charging at him from behind, while the Wendigo approached from the front. He was trapped, surrounded, doomed. Then the shotgun boomed. Thomas Begay emerged from the trees, his ancient weapon smoking. The buckshot struck the Skinwalker in the back, making it stumble, giving Elan an opening. He took it, running past the Wendigo, feeling the cold reach for him, his skin blistering with frostbite where the freezing air touched him. "The Kiva," Thomas shouted. "Lead them to the Kiva." Elan didn't need to be told twice. He ran, and the monsters followed, and the hunt was on. Elan ran through the night with death on his heels. Behind him, the two monsters followed, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes united in their pursuit. The forest became a maze of terror, every shadow hiding a threat, every sound a warning. Thomas Begay ran beside him, the old man's endurance surprising for his age. He had abandoned his shotgun after the first shot, knowing it was useless against these foes. Now he clutched his prayer bundle, muttering protections in a language that predated history. "They're slowing," Thomas gasped. "The Kiva is close, sacred ground, they feel it." Elan could feel it too, a pressure in the air, a wrongness that was somehow right. They were approaching the ceremonial center, a place that had been holy to his people for centuries. The ground beneath his feet felt different, alive in a way that defied explanation. Behind them, the Wendigo roared. It didn't like this place. The sacred energy that permeated the soil was anathema to its nature, a warmth that couldn't be frozen, a light that couldn't be extinguished. The Skinwalker felt it too, but differently. It was drawn to the Kiva, sensing the power that lay dormant there. It was a creature of magic, born from corruption and maintained through stolen rituals. Sacred space called to it, sang to it, promised power if it could only enter. "They'll separate," Thomas predicted. "The Wendigo will circle around, try to cut us off from behind. The Skinwalker will go straight through, try to reach the center before us." "How do you know?" "Because I've read the stories, because this has happened before, because they always do the same thing, these ancient ones. They are patterns, not people. They follow their natures." They burst from the trees into the open space around the Kiva. It was a circular depression in the earth, 50 feet across, lined with stone that gleamed with inlaid turquoise and shell. The entrance was a narrow tunnel leading down into darkness, a sacred womb that had birthed generations of ceremonies. Thomas stopped at the edge, turning to face their pursuers. "Inside," he commanded Elan. "Go down, wait for me." "I'm not leaving you." You must, the trap requires both of us. One inside, one out. Go, now. Elan went, sliding down the tunnel into the sacred darkness. The kiva was larger inside than it appeared from above, a circular chamber with a floor of packed earth and walls adorned with ancient paintings, spirals, stars, figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. He crouched in the center, his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the entrance above. He could hear Thomas chanting, hear the monsters approaching, hear the clash as they met at the kiva's edge. "Sacred ground," Thomas called out, his voice strong despite his age. "You cannot enter, Ice Heart. The warmth here will burn you." The Wendigo roared, a sound like glaciers calving. "I am the end of warmth. I will freeze this place and break it and scatter its bones across the ice." "Try then. Try and see what the ancients built to contain your kind." Something struck the earth above, a blow that shook the entire structure. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and Elan saw cracks appear in the stone lining the tunnel. The Wendigo was attacking the kiva itself, trying to break through from above. But the Skinwalker was more cunning. It appeared at the tunnel entrance, silhouetted against the moonlight, its form shifting, changing, trying to find a shape that could pass through the sacred barrier. "Little Ranger," it called, using Elan's mother's voice. "Come out, little Ranger, it's safe now. The monster is gone, come to Mama." Elan fired, the shot echoing in the confined space. The Skinwalker laughed, the sound like breaking glass, and retreated from the entrance. "Stubborn," it said. "I like stubborn prey. The struggle makes the meat sweeter." Another blow from above, and more dust fell. The Wendigo was digging now, its massive claws tearing at the earth, trying to reach them from above. It didn't understand the kiva's nature, didn't realize that the sacred space extended below ground as well as above. "Thomas," Elan shouted, "what's the plan?" "Hold them," the old man called back. "Keep them fighting each other, keep them distracted." "And then what?" "And then I seal them in." Elan didn't understand, but he didn't have time to ask. The Skinwalker was attacking the tunnel entrance, its claws scraping against stone that resisted its nature. The Wendigo was breaking through from above, the ceiling cracking under its assault. He was trapped between them, in a space that was rapidly becoming a death trap. Then the Skinwalker made its move. It retreated from the entrance, running around the kiva's edge, and Elan heard Thomas scream. He scrambled up the tunnel, emerging into moonlight just in time to see the Skinwalker dragging the old man away, its claws in his shoulders, his blood dark on the ground. "No," Elan charged, firing as he ran. The bullet struck the Skinwalker, making it stumble, but it didn't release its grip. It turned, smiling with too many teeth, and threw Thomas toward the Wendigo. The ice-hearted monster caught the old man in midair, massive fingers wrapping around his frail body. Frost spread instantly, covering Thomas's skin, his hair, his clothes. He screamed, a sound that cut off abruptly as his lungs froze. The Wendigo raised him high, then brought him down on its knee, shattering him like a frozen statue. The pieces scattered across the ground, steaming in the warm night air, and the Wendigo laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "One less warm thing in the world," it rumbled. The Skinwalker clapped its hands mockingly. "Beautiful, simply beautiful. We make a good team, Ice Heart." "We are not a team. We are the end of things, and when I am done with the warm ones, I will freeze you too." "Promises, promises." They turned toward Elan, united again in their hunger. He stood at the kiva's edge, his rifle empty, his knife useless, his friend dead at his feet. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no hope of escape. "The Ranger," the Skinwalker purred. "Last of the warm ones, shall we share?" "I will freeze him," the Wendigo said, "and I will break him, and I will scatter his pieces across the ice." "So much drama, just kill him and be done." Elan did the only thing he could think of. He ran, not away, but toward them, screaming a war cry his grandfather had taught him, a cry that spoke of defiance in the face of death, of dignity in the face of despair. He ran between them, through the gap where their attention had wavered, through the space where their mutual hatred created an opening. He felt the cold of the Wendigo on one side, the warmth of the Skinwalker on the other, and then he was past them, running for the trees. They followed, of course. They were monsters, but they were also predators, and predators cannot resist fleeing prey. They gave chase, crashing through the undergrowth, their bulk and speed making a mockery of stealth. Elan ran until he couldn't run anymore, his lungs burning, his legs giving out. He collapsed against a tree, waiting for the end, and heard them approaching. But they stopped. They had found something else, something that distracted them from their pursuit. Elan raised his head, looking through the branches, and saw what had captured their attention. A hogan, a traditional Navajo dwelling, smoke rising from its chimney, light glowing from its windows. There were people inside, a family, children. "No," Elan whispered. "No, no, no." The Skinwalker looked at the Wendigo, and the Wendigo looked back. For a moment, they communicated without words, predators recognizing shared territory. "The small ones first," the Skinwalker suggested. "They scream the loudest." "The small ones freeze the fastest," the Wendigo agreed. They moved toward the hogan, and Elan found strength he didn't know he had. He ran after them, shouting, throwing rocks, doing anything to draw their attention. "Here, over here, I'm the one you want. Leave them alone." The Skinwalker turned, annoyed. "Persistent, aren't you? I'm your prey, not them, me." "There's enough for everyone," the Skinwalker said reasonably. "Why should we choose?" "Because," Elan struggled for words, for leverage, for anything that might save those people. "Because I challenge you, both of you, a contest. If I win, you leave this place forever. If you win, we eat you anyway," the Wendigo finished. "There is no win for you, warm one, only the manner of your ending." "Then make it interesting," Elan said desperately. "Make it sport. The Skinwalker understands sport, doesn't it? The joy of the hunt." The Skinwalker tilted its head, considering. "He has a point, Iceheart. There's no pleasure in simply freezing them. Where's the artistry? Where's the challenge?" "I am challenge enough," the Wendigo roared. "I am winter and death and the end of all things. I do not play games with prey." "But I do," the Skinwalker said softly, "and I want to hear what he proposes." Elan's mind raced. He needed time, needed to get them away from the hogan, needed to lead them back to the kiva where Thomas had said they could be trapped. But how? What contest could possibly distract two monsters long enough to spring a trap? "The kiva," he said. "A race. First one to reach the center of the kiva wins, me, and the loser has to leave the reservation forever." The Skinwalker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "A race against this lumbering glacier, child's play." "I accept," the Wendigo rumbled. "But when I win, I will freeze you both. The Skinwalker first, slowly, so you can feel your stolen warmth draining away. Then the Ranger fast, so you don't have time to suffer." "And when I win," the Skinwalker countered, "I'll wear your skin, Iceheart. I'll be the Wendigo for a while. See how that feels." "To the kiva," Elan said. "On 3, 1, 2. They were already moving. The Skinwalker ran on 2 legs, then 4, then something in between, its form shifting to maximize speed. The Wendigo crashed through the undergrowth, its bulk making its own path, ice forming where its feet touched the ground. Elan ran too, but he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to survive long enough to reach the trap, to trigger whatever mechanism Thomas had planned to end this nightmare. They reached the kiva clearing simultaneously, the Skinwalker from the east, the Wendigo from the west. They paused at the edge, eyeing each other, eyeing the dark entrance to the sacred chamber. "After you," the Skinwalker mocked, gesturing toward the tunnel. "I do not fear the dark," the Wendigo replied, but it didn't move. They were stalling, Elan realized. They sensed the danger, the sacred power that filled this place. They were ancient enough to recognize a trap when they saw one, even if they didn't know its exact nature. Afraid, Elan taunted, desperate to keep them focused on each other rather than on him. The great Wendigo, afraid of a hole in the ground. The mighty Skinwalker, scared of the dark. "I fear nothing," the Wendigo said and stepped forward. The moment its foot touched the earth of the Kiva, the world changed. Power surged from the ground, ancient and sacred, the accumulated blessing of generations. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like glaciers calving, and pulled back, its foot smoking where the sacred earth had touched it. "Trick," it roared, "the warm one tricks us." "No trick," Elan said, standing at the tunnel entrance, just the end of the line. The Skinwalker laughed. "Clever, very clever, but incomplete. You can't seal us in there unless we're both inside, and I have no intention of entering that hole." "Then you'll fight," Elan said. "Out here, where everyone can see you, where everyone will know what you are." "They already know," the Skinwalker said softly. "The stories never die." It attacked without warning, moving faster than Elan could track. He threw himself sideways, feeling the wind of its passage, the brush of claws against his jacket. He rolled, came up running, and the chase began. Around the Kiva they went, Elan leading, the Skinwalker pursuing, the Wendigo watching from the edge, waiting for its moment. It was a deadly dance, 3 predators circling a sacred center, each waiting for the others to falter. Elan tripped, his foot catching a root, and went down hard. The Skinwalker was on him in an instant, its weight pressing him into the earth, its breath hot and foul against his face. "Got you," it whispered. Then the cold hit. The Wendigo had moved, circling around while they were distracted, reaching the tunnel entrance from the other side. It didn't enter, couldn't enter, but it could reach in, could extend its freezing touch into the sacred space. The Skinwalker felt it first, the cold seeping into its stolen warmth, threatening to freeze it from the outside in. It scrambled off Elan, hissing, its form shifting rapidly, trying to find a shape that could resist the cold. "Cheater," it screamed. "This is not your game, Iceheart." "All games are mine," the Wendigo rumbled. "All endings belong to winter." It reached further, extending its arm into the tunnel, and Elan saw his chance. He was on his feet, running, not away but toward the Wendigo, toward the monster that had killed Thomas, that had threatened his people. "Hey," he shouted, "over here." The Wendigo turned, its eyeless face somehow focusing on him. "The warm one, the persistent warm one. I will freeze you slowly so you can feel every moment of it." "Try it," Elan said, and threw himself into the tunnel. The Wendigo roared and reached after him, but its arm hit the barrier of sacred earth, and it recoiled, smoking, furious. It couldn't enter. The Kiva's protection was too strong. But the Skinwalker had no such limitation. It was a creature of stolen magic, of corrupted ritual. Sacred space didn't harm it, it called to it, sang to it, promised power. It followed Elan into the tunnel, sliding down into the darkness, its eyes glowing with predatory glee. "Trapped," it hissed. "You've trapped yourself, little ranger. Now it's just you and me in the dark with nowhere to run." Elan stood in the center of the Kiva, his back to the wall, his knife in his hand. Above, through the entrance, he could see the Wendigo's bulk blocking out the stars, could hear its frustrated roars as it tried to reach them. "Not trapped," he said, "contained." "The same thing." "Not quite." From his pocket, Elan pulled Thomas's prayer bundle, the one the old man had pressed into his hand in their final moment together. He didn't know the words, didn't know the ritual, but he knew intent. He knew will. He knew desperation. He threw the bundle at the Skinwalker, and as it left his hand, he spoke the only prayer he knew, the words his grandmother had taught him before she died. "May the holy people watch over us. May the sun warm us. May the rain cool us. May the earth support us. May the breeze refresh us. The prayer bundle ignited. It wasn't fire, not exactly. It was light, pure and white, filling the kiva with radiance that had no source. The Skinwalker screamed, a sound like 1,000 voices in agony, and recoiled, its stolen forms melting away, revealing something beneath that was too terrible to look at directly. No, it shrieked. This is not possible, this is not permitted. It's happening, Elan said, advancing, forcing the creature back toward the tunnel entrance. You're done, you're finished. I am eternal, I am endless, I am. The Wendigo's hand closed around the Skinwalker's ankle. It had found a way. It had forced its arm through the barrier, had endured the burning, had reached into the sacred space to grab its enemy. Now it pulled, dragging the Skinwalker back toward the entrance, toward the cold, toward the ice. Mine, the Wendigo rumbled. You are mine. No, let go, let go. They struggled, the Wendigo's cold against the Skinwalker's stolen warmth, ice against flesh, winter against corruption. The Skinwalker grabbed Elan, trying to use him as an anchor, and for a moment they were all connected, all bound together in a chain of hate and hunger. Then Elan did the only thing he could. He dropped his knife, reached into his pocket and pulled out the detonator. Thomas had told him in those final moments. The kiva could be sealed, but only from the outside, only by someone willing to sacrifice themselves. The entrance had to be collapsed, the tunnel filled with rubble, the monsters buried under tons of sacred earth. Elan wasn't outside. He was inside, but he was also at the edge, at the boundary between sacred and profane, and if he could trigger the charges that Thomas had placed. He pressed the button. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, a roar of sound and stone and dust. The ceiling above the entrance collapsed, tons of rock plummeting down, filling the tunnel, blocking the exit. The Wendigo roared, trapped outside, its arm severed by the falling stone. The Skinwalker shrieked, trapped inside, buried under the rubble. And Elan was caught in between. He felt the cold first, the Wendigo's freezing touch that had wrapped around the Skinwalker's ankle now reaching for him. Then the heat, the Skinwalker's stolen warmth that was somehow worse, a mockery of life that burned where it touched. He was being pulled apart, frozen and burned simultaneously, his body caught between two impossible forces. Then he remembered Thomas's final words, whispered as the Skinwalker dragged him away. The center, the sacred center. If all else fails, go to the center and let the earth take you. Elan let go. He stopped fighting, stopped resisting, stopped trying to hold onto his place in the world. He let himself fall down through the rubble, down through the broken floor, down into the earth beneath the kiva. The sacred earth received him. He fell into darkness, into silence, into a space that was neither cold nor warm but simply present. He lay there, broken and bleeding, and felt the power of the place surround him like a blanket. Above he could hear the monsters, the Wendigo roaring its frustration, unable to reach its prey. The Skinwalker shrieking its rage, trapped in the rubble. They were separated now, divided by tons of sacred stone, unable to reach each other, unable to reach him. But they were still alive, still active, still dangerous. Elan closed his eyes, accepting that this might be his end. He had done what he could. He had trapped them, contained them, limited the damage they could do. It would have to be enough. He drifted into unconsciousness, the sacred earth cradling him like a mother with a child. Elan woke to pain. It was everywhere, his bones, his muscles, his skin, his mind. He was lying on something hard and cold, his body twisted into a position that shouldn't have been possible. He tried to move and found that he couldn't, his limbs unresponsive, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He opened his eyes to darkness, absolute, complete darkness that pressed against his eyeballs like a physical weight. He was underground, he realized, buried beneath the collapsed kiva, trapped in the sacred earth that had received him. But he was alive. That was something. The fall should have killed him, the impact should have shattered him, but here he was, breathing, thinking, existing. The sacred earth, he remembered. Thomas had said it would protect him, and it had, cradling him in its embrace, keeping him alive despite the odds. He lay still for a long time, listening. Above he could hear sounds, the shifting of rubble, the distant roars of the Wendigo, the occasional shriek that might have been the Skinwalker. They were still up there, still trapped, still fighting. He needed to get out, needed to find help, find a way to finish what Thomas had started, find a way to seal the monsters permanently. But he couldn't move. His legs were broken, he was certain of that now. He could feel the wrongness of the angles, the grinding of bone against bone when he tried to shift. His left arm was numb, possibly paralyzed. His chest felt tight, each breath a struggle against ribs that were likely cracked. He was dying, slowly but dying, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then he heard the voice. Elan Yazi. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A whisper in the darkness speaking his name. "Who's there?" he tried to shout, but it came out as a croak. Elan Yazi, Ranger, Hunter, Protector. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him, permeating the darkness. It was not human, he realized, not exactly. It was the voice of the place itself, the spirit of the sacred earth that had saved him. "I am dying," he whispered. "You are changing," the voice corrected. "The earth has accepted you. The holy people have marked you. You have touched the dark, and now the dark touches back." "What does that mean?" "It means you have a choice. You can die here in the dark and be at peace, or you can live and carry the dark with you and be changed by it." "I don't understand." The Wendigo and the Skinwalker are ancient enemies. They have fought for centuries across lands and peoples. They are balanced, these two, ice and flesh, hunger and malice, destruction and corruption. Where one exists, the other follows. They are bound by their natures to conflict. So they can be bound together, trapped in eternal struggle, each preventing the other from escaping, each consuming the other's power. They can be sealed, not just contained, but truly imprisoned. How? A sacrifice, a life given freely, given completely to power the seal. The Kiva was built for this purpose, to hold the ancient evils until they could be properly dealt with. But it requires a guardian, someone to maintain the seal, to feed it with their presence, to ensure it never breaks. "You're saying I have to stay here, forever? Or let them go, let them escape, let them continue their war across your land, your people, your world?" Elan thought of the bodies he had seen. Charlie Tallhorse frozen and broken, the deer on the ridge arranged like offerings, the Benelli children skinned alive, Thomas Begay shattered by the Wendigo's cold embrace. He thought of his family, his friends, his people, the reservation that was his home, the land that was his responsibility. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll stay, I'll be the guardian." "Then accept the earth's embrace. Let it heal you, let it change you, and prepare for the binding." The darkness moved. It was no longer empty, no longer void. It was filled with something, power, energy, the accumulated blessing of centuries. It flowed into him, through him, replacing broken bone with sacred stone, torn muscle with living earth, damaged flesh with ancient power. He felt himself changing, growing, becoming something else. The pain intensified, then transformed, becoming something else entirely. It was no longer suffering but metamorphosis, the agony of rebirth, the trauma of transformation. When it ended, he was no longer human. He rose from the earth, his new form massive, powerful, not quite flesh and not quite stone. He could see in the darkness now, could perceive the sacred geometry of the Kiva, could feel the presence of the monsters above him like a weight on his consciousness. The Skinwalker was trapped in the rubble, its stolen form stripped away by the collapse, its true nature exposed, a writhing mass of flesh and bone and stolen souls, trying to find a shape that could escape. The Wendigo circled above, its cold presence freezing the ground, trying to find a way down. Between them, Elan stood. Ranger, the Skinwalker's voice was different now, stripped of its mocking tone, filled with something like fear. What are you? I am the Guardian, Elan said, and his voice was the voice of the earth itself, deep and resonant and ancient. I am the seal. I am the end of your war. You can't stop us, the Skinwalker shrieked. We're eternal, we're endless, we're bound, Elan finished. He reached out with hands that were no longer hands, with power that was no longer his own, and grabbed both monsters. The Skinwalker he pulled down into the earth, into the sacred space beneath the Kiva where no corrupted thing should be able to exist. The Wendigo he pulled in, through the rubble, through the barriers of stone, into the same space. They screamed in unison, their voices harmonizing in a chord of pure agony. The sacred earth rejected them, burned them, tried to expel them, but Elan held them firm. You will face each other, he commanded. You will fight each other, you will consume each other, and you will never escape. He placed them in the center of the Kiva, the deepest point, the place where the sacred power was strongest. He forced them together, flesh against ice, warmth against cold, and bound them with chains of light that emerged from the walls themselves. No, the Wendigo roared. This is not possible, this is not permitted. It is happening, Elan said. It is done. The Skinwalker tried to shift, tried to find a form that could escape, but the sacred chains held it fast. It tried to reach for Elan, to steal his new form, his power, but he was beyond its reach now, beyond its understanding. What are you? It whispered. I am the land's answer to your corruption. I am the people's protection against your hunger. I am the guardian of the threshold, the keeper of the seal, the one who stands between you and the world. He stepped back, retreating into the walls of the Kiva, becoming one with the stone, the earth, the sacred space. He was the Kiva now, the Kiva was him, and the monsters were trapped inside, locked in eternal struggle. The Skinwalker lunged at the Wendigo, claws extended, teeth bared. The Wendigo met it with ice and rage, freezing the Skinwalker's arm solid, shattering it with a blow. The Skinwalker screamed and reformed, attacking again, and the battle began in earnest. They tore at each other with all the fury of their ancient hatred. The Skinwalker shifted constantly, trying to find a form that could withstand the Wendigo's cold, while the Wendigo unleashed its freezing touch, trying to turn the Skinwalker's stolen warmth against it. They were evenly matched. That was the beauty of it, Elan realized. That was why the binding worked. They were perfect enemies, perfectly opposed, and neither could ever truly defeat the other. The Skinwalker could heal from any wound, could change any form, could adapt to any attack. The Wendigo could freeze any substance, could shatter any structure, could endure any assault. They would fight forever, or until the world ended, or until the sacred seal weakened enough for one of them to finally gain the upper hand. Elan would ensure that moment never came. He watched them for a long time, the eternal battle, the endless war. Then he turned his attention outward to the world above, to the reservation, and the people he had sworn to protect. He could feel them now, all of them. Every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of fear or joy or sorrow. He was connected to the land in a way he had never been before, bound to every living thing that walked upon it. He was the reservation now, its guardian, its protector, its spirit. And he would remain so until the end of time. The rescue team found the collapsed Kiva 3 days later. They had been searching for Elan since he disappeared, following the trail of destruction left by the monsters. They found the Hogan where the Benelli family had died, the frozen bodies of the deer, the shattered remains of Thomas Begay. They followed the tracks to the Kiva, saw the collapsed entrance, the frozen ground, the signs of struggle. They dug carefully, knowing that something terrible had happened here, something that defied explanation. They cleared the rubble from the entrance, revealing the tunnel that led down into darkness. The tribal shaman, a woman named Grace Tsosi who had studied with Thomas Begay, insisted on being the first to enter. She descended into the sacred space with her prayer bundle in hand, prepared for the worst. What she found was beyond her understanding. The kiva was intact, the walls still adorned with their ancient paintings, the floor still packed with sacred earth. But in the center, where the ceremonial fire should have been, there was something else. Two figures locked in combat. One was a monstrosity of ice and pale flesh, 15 feet tall, its limbs too long, its face a frozen mask of rage. The other was a writhing mass of stolen skins, constantly shifting, trying to find a form that could escape. They were frozen, not by cold but by time itself, trapped in a single moment of eternal struggle. They didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't exist in any normal sense. They were statues, preserved by power that Grace could feel pulsing from the very walls. And between them, embedded in the earth, was a figure she recognized. Elan Yazi. But not the Elan she had known. This figure was massive, made of stone and earth and something else, something that glowed with inner light. His eyes were open, staring upward, but they were filled with the same sacred power that permeated the kiva. Elan, she whispered. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But Grace felt something, a presence that acknowledged her, that recognized her, that welcomed her into the sacred space. You've become the guardian, she realized. You've bound them, you've sealed them. The presence confirmed. Yes, it was done. The monsters were trapped, the war was contained, the reservation was safe. But at what cost? Grace asked. You're trapped here too, you're part of the seal. Sacrifice. The word echoed in her mind, unspoken but clear. Sacrifice was required. Someone had to pay the price. Elan had paid it. He had become the guardian, the seal, the binding. Can you be freed? Not without releasing them, not without breaking the seal, not without starting the war again. Then we will remember you, Grace promised. We will tell your story, we will honor your sacrifice. You will be remembered as the one who stopped the monsters, who protected the people, who gave everything for the land. The presence radiated something like peace, contentment, acceptance. Grace performed a blessing, a ceremony of thanks and farewell. She sprinkled sacred corn pollen around the chamber, sang the songs that Thomas had taught her, acknowledged the power that had transformed Elan into something more than human. Then she left, climbing back to the surface, to the world of sun and wind and living things. She ordered the kiva resealed, the entrance blocked, the site declared sacred and forbidden. The tribal council agreed, understanding what had happened here, what price had been paid. The story would be told, not as fact but as legend. The ranger who became the guardian, who bound the ancient enemies in eternal struggle, who gave his humanity to protect his people. Elan Yazi would become a myth, a spirit, a protector watching over the reservation from his underground chamber. And below, in the dark, he watched the monsters fight, their eternal battle frozen in time, their hatred contained by his sacrifice. He was the seal, he was the guardian, he was the land. And he would remain so forever. 50 years passed. The reservation changed. New houses were built, old ones torn down. New families arrived, old ones moved away. The stories of the Wendigo and the Skinwalker faded into legend, becoming cautionary tales told to children, warnings against the dangers of the backcountry. But some remembered. The tribal shamans kept the knowledge alive, passing it from generation to generation. The kiva remained sealed, guarded, forbidden. And once a year, on the anniversary of the binding, they would visit the site, leave offerings, acknowledge the sacrifice that kept them safe. The world changed too. Technology advanced, cities grew, the wilderness shrank. But in the deep places, in the dark corners of the earth, the old things still slept. And sometimes they woke. In 2079, a hiker in the Ozarks disappeared. His remains were found 3 days later, frozen solid in the middle of a summer heat wave. In 2084, a family in rural Pennsylvania was found slaughtered, their skins removed, arranged in patterns that suggested ritual rather than murder. The patterns were recognized by those who knew the old stories. The Wendigo and the Skinwalker were not unique. They were archetypes, manifestations of ancient evils that had existed since before humanity, that would exist long after. And somewhere in a sealed chamber beneath the Navajo reservation, the guardian stirred. He felt the disturbances, felt the awakening of other powers, felt the cycle beginning again. The binding was strong but not absolute. The monsters he contained would never escape, but their kind could manifest elsewhere, could feed on other fears, could find new battlegrounds. He could do nothing about that. He was bound to this place, to this seal, to this eternal duty. But he could watch, could warn, could reach out to those who might listen, might understand, might continue the fight. In the dreams of a young Navajo ranger, a new guardian in training, he appeared. Not as a monster, not as a god, but as a man who had made a choice, who had paid a price, who had become something more than human to protect what he loved. The dark is patient, he told the dreamer. It waits, it watches, it will always return, but so will we. We are the guardians, we are the seal, we are the land's answer to the darkness. The dreamer woke with tears in her eyes, not knowing why she wept, but knowing that she had been given a responsibility she didn't yet understand. She would learn. They all would learn. The cycle continued, the battle went on, and the guardian stood watch, forever vigilant, forever ready. Because the dark was patient. But so were they. Grace Tsosi stood at the edge of the sealed kiva, watching the morning sun burn away the mist that clung to the earth. 3 days had passed since she had descended into that sacred darkness, since she had seen what Elan Yazi had become, since she had understood the price of salvation. It was a heavy price, perhaps too heavy. She was 52 years old, a grandmother twice over, a shaman who had trained under Thomas Begay himself. She had seen spirits, had spoken with the holy people, had witnessed miracles and horrors that would have broken lesser women, but nothing had prepared her for this. The tribal council had met in emergency session and she had told them everything. The Wendigo, the Skinwalker, the battle in the forest, Thomas's death, Elan's sacrifice. The binding that now held the monsters beneath their feet, contained but not destroyed, imprisoned but not ended. They had listened in silence, these elected officials, these modern men and women who governed a nation within a nation. Some had believed her, others had not, but all had agreed on one thing. The kiva must remain sealed, the story must be preserved, and the guardian must be honored. Now she stood alone, carrying out the first duty of the new guardian's priesthood. She had brought offerings, corn pollen, turquoise, tobacco, and water, the traditional gifts of her people. She would place them at the edge of the seal, where Elan's presence was strongest, where he could receive them. "I come to honor the guardian," she said aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I come to acknowledge the sacrifice. I come to maintain the seal." She scattered the corn pollen in the 4 directions, then placed the other offerings at the cardinal points. The turquoise she buried shallowly, so that its power could sink into the earth. The tobacco she burned, so that its smoke could carry her prayers to the sky. The water she poured onto the ground, so that it could return to the earth that had given it. "Elan Yazi," she said, "Ranger, Hunter, Protector, Guardian, I honor you, I remember you, I thank you." For a moment nothing happened. Then she felt it, a warmth in the ground beneath her feet, a presence that rose up to meet her, that surrounded her like an embrace. The guardian was aware, the guardian was watching, the guardian was grateful. She stayed for an hour, meditating, praying, opening herself to whatever communication might come. But the guardian was silent now, his attention turned inward, focused on the eternal task of maintaining the seal. She left when the sun was high, returning to her truck, to her home, to her life. But she knew she would return. They all would return, the shamans and the healers, the keepers of tradition, the ones who remembered. The Kiva was not just a prison now, it was a temple, and Elan Yazi was not just a man, he was a god. The first year was the hardest. The reservation had to heal. The families of the dead, the Benellis, Charlie Tallhorse, the others, needed closure, needed explanations, needed something to help them understand why their loved ones had been taken. The official story was bear attacks. That was what the FBI agents reported, what the state investigators concluded, what the newspapers printed. Strange bear attacks, possibly rabid, certainly unusual, but ultimately natural. The unofficial story was more complex. The elders spoke of ancient evils awakened, of prophecies fulfilled, of a great battle between winter and corruption. They spoke of Thomas Begay, the last traditional medicine man, who had given his life to protect his people. They spoke of Elan Yazi, the ranger who had become something more, who had bound the monsters and saved the reservation. Most people didn't believe the unofficial story. They couldn't. It was too strange, too impossible, too frightening. Better to accept the bear attacks, to mourn the dead, to move on with life. But some believed. The ones who had seen things, who had heard the screams in the night, who had felt the cold that shouldn't exist. They believed, and they were grateful, and they honored the guardian in their own ways. A small shrine appeared at the edge of the sealed kiva. Flowers, candles, photographs of the dead, prayers written on scraps of paper, tucked into cracks in the stones. Offerings of food and drink, left for the guardian to sustain him in his eternal vigil. The tribal police left it alone. The tribal council declared the site sacred, off-limits to development, protected by law and tradition. And the monsters stayed bound. The Wendigo and the Skinwalker remained trapped in their eternal struggle, frozen in the moment of their capture, their hatred contained by Elan's sacrifice. But they were not silent. Even from within the seal they could reach out, could touch the world, could influence the minds of those who came too close. Grace felt it first. In her dreams she would see them, the ice-hearted one and the skin thief, still fighting, still struggling, their rage undimmed by decades of imprisonment. They would speak to her, offering power, offering knowledge, offering release from the burdens of mortality. "Join us," the Wendigo would whisper, its voice like wind across frozen lakes. "Become ice, become eternal, feel nothing, want nothing, be free." "Join us," the Skinwalker would hiss, its voice like rustling skin. "Become everything, become anyone, know all secrets, wear all faces, be free." She refused them. Every time she refused. But she could feel their influence growing, their reach extending, their power leaking through the cracks in the seal. The guardian was weakening, not failing. Elan's will was too strong for that, but weakening. He had been human once, was still human in some essential way, and humans were not built for eternity. The strain was showing. Grace consulted with the other shamans, the other keepers of tradition. They searched their lore, their histories, their memories for any mention of what to do when a guardian faltered. They found nothing. This had never happened before. The binding of the Wendigo and Skinwalker was unique, unprecedented, unrecorded. They would have to improvise. Elan felt himself fading. Not dying. He was beyond death now, beyond any normal ending. But fading, thinning, spreading himself too thin across too much time. He was the kiva now, was the seal, was the binding itself. He felt every moment of the monster's struggle, every surge of their hatred, every attempt to break free. He held them, contained them, imprisoned them, but it took everything he had. And he was still human in some essential way. He still remembered what it was to walk in the sun, to breathe fresh air, to touch another person. He still felt the phantom sensations of a body he no longer possessed, the ache of muscles, the flutter of heartbeat, the warmth of skin. He still dreamed. That was the hardest part. In his dreams, he was human again, walking the trails of the reservation, visiting his family, living a normal life. And then he would wake, if waking was the word for returning to this existence, and remember that he was stone and earth and sacred power, that he would never be human again, that his sacrifice was eternal. Sometimes he wondered if it was worth it, if he had made the right choice, if the world wouldn't have been better off if he had let the monsters go, if he had died like Thomas, if he had taken the easy path. But then he would feel them, the people of the reservation, going about their lives, safe and warm and alive. He would feel their children playing, their elders telling stories, their ceremonies honoring the traditions that stretched back centuries. He had saved them. That was worth any price, worth any sacrifice, worth eternity itself. But he was weakening. He could admit that to himself, if to no one else. The strain of maintaining the seal was wearing on him, grinding him down, making him less than he had been. The monsters felt it too. They redoubled their efforts, fighting harder, struggling more desperately, trying to break through while he was vulnerable. He couldn't let them, wouldn't let them. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would hold them. He would maintain the seal. He would fulfill his duty. He was the guardian. He was the seal. He was the land's answer to the darkness. And he would remain so forever. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen was a folklorist from Arizona State University, studying Navajo oral traditions for her dissertation. She had heard rumors of the sealed kiva, of the guardian spirit, of the battle between ancient evils. She had come to the reservation seeking access, seeking interviews, seeking understanding. The tribal council had refused her. The kiva was sacred, they said, forbidden. No outsiders could approach, could study, could disturb. But Sarah was persistent. She had spent her career studying the intersection of myth and reality, searching for the truths that lay beneath the stories. She had heard about the disappearances, the frozen bodies, the impossible events that had preceded the sealing. She knew that something had happened here, something real, something physical, something that could be studied and understood. So she had come in secret, hiking through the backcountry, avoiding the roads, approaching the kiva from the wilderness side. She had found the shrine, the offerings, the signs of veneration that marked the site as holy. And she had found something else. A crack in the seal, a place where the earth had shifted, where the stones had parted, where a sliver of darkness was visible from above. She shouldn't have approached it. She knew that intellectually. She was trespassing on sacred ground, disturbing something that had been sealed for a reason, risking consequences she couldn't imagine. But she was a scholar. She was driven by curiosity, by the need to know, by the hunger for understanding that was stronger than fear. She knelt beside the crack, her flashlight probing the darkness within. She saw stone and earth and something else, something that glowed with faint luminescence. Then she saw the eye. It was looking at her from the darkness, a single eye glowing with sickly yellow light. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at her with an intelligence that was utterly alien and utterly malevolent. She stumbled back, her heart hammering, her breath coming in gasps. She had seen it. She had seen the thing that was imprisoned below. And it had seen her. She ran, abandoning her pack, her notes, her dignity. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out, until she collapsed against a tree, sobbing, shaking, knowing that she had made a terrible mistake. She felt it following her, not physically. It was still trapped, still sealed, still imprisoned. But it was reaching out, touching her mind, marking her, claiming her. She would never be free. She knew that now. She had looked into the eye of something ancient and evil, and it had looked back. She was connected to it now, bound to it, claimed by it. She made it back to her car, drove to the nearest hospital, checked herself in for observation. The doctors found nothing wrong with her physically. No wounds, no illness, no sign of exposure or trauma. But she knew. She knew what was waiting for her, what was watching her, what would come for her when the seal finally broke. Because it was going to break. She had seen that too in the moment of connection. The Guardian was weakening. The seal was cracking. The monsters would escape sooner or later, and when they did, they would remember her face. She spent the next year researching, desperately trying to find a way to strengthen the seal, to help the Guardian, to prevent the catastrophe she knew was coming. She found nothing. The traditions were too fragmented, the knowledge too scattered, the shamans too protective of their secrets. But she did find one thing, a name, Elan Yazi, the ranger who had become the Guardian, who had sacrificed himself to bind the monsters, who was still down there, still fighting, still holding the line. She returned to the reservation, not to the kiva. She would never go near that place again, but to the tribal offices, to the council chambers, to anyone who would listen. "I can help him," she told Grace Tsosi, the shaman who had first blessed the seal. "I can reach him. I can give him strength." "How?" Grace asked, skeptical but desperate. "By going in, by joining him, by sharing the burden. You would sacrifice yourself, become like him. If that's what it takes. I caused this. I weakened the seal. I have to help fix it." Grace studied her for a long moment, seeing the truth in her eyes. "You're sincere," she said finally, "but you're also naive. The Guardian's burden is not one that can be shared. It's not a job, not a duty. It's a transformation. You don't just decide to become the seal. You have to become the land itself." "Then teach me, show me how." "I don't know how. No one knows how. Elan did it instinctively, desperately, in the moment of sacrifice. No one has ever been able to replicate it." "Then I'll find another way. I'll study, I'll research, I'll do whatever it takes." Grace smiled sadly. "You remind me of him, determined, stubborn, willing to pay any price." "Is that enough?" "It's a start." 20 years passed. Dr. Sarah Chen had become something of a legend in her own right. She had devoted her life to studying the kiva, the Guardian, the seal. She had written books, given lectures, trained apprentices. She had become the foremost expert on the binding of the Wendigo and Skinwalker. And she had found a way. It wasn't the same as Elan's sacrifice. It couldn't be. She couldn't become the seal, couldn't take his place, couldn't share his burden. But she could strengthen it. She could add her will to his, her energy to his, her life force to the power that maintained the binding. It required a ritual. An ancient ritual, reconstructed from fragments of tradition, combined with modern understanding of energy and consciousness. She would have to go to the kiva, enter the sacred space, and offer herself as a channel, a conduit, a way for the Guardian to draw strength from the world above. It was dangerous. It might kill her. It might trap her as Elan was trapped, neither alive nor dead, human nor spirit. But she was willing to pay that price. She had looked into the eye of evil, and she knew what waited if the seal broke. Better to become part of the solution than to wait helplessly for the end. The ritual took place at dawn, on the autumnal equinox when the boundaries between worlds were thinnest. Grace Tsosi led the ceremony, now an old woman herself, the last of the traditional shamans. A dozen others participated, healers, singers, keepers of tradition. Sarah stood at the edge of the crack she had opened so many years ago, the crack that had started this journey. She was 63 years old, her hair gray, her body worn by decades of research and travel. But her eyes were clear, her will was strong, her determination unshakable. "Elan Yazi," she said, speaking directly to the Guardian. "I come to help, I come to strengthen, I come to share the burden." She descended into the crack, into the darkness, into the sacred space below. She found him immediately. He was everywhere and nowhere, the stone and earth and power that permeated the kiva. She could feel his awareness, his recognition, his gratitude. "You're here," his voice echoed in her mind. "You came." I came to help, to share the burden, to give you strength. You don't know what you're offering. I know, I've studied, I've prepared, I'm ready. There was a pause, a moment of consideration. Then, very well, accept the transformation, become part of the seal, join me in the vigil. The power surged through her, the same power that had transformed Elan, that had made him the guardian. It was sacred and ancient and terrible, the accumulated blessing of centuries, the living energy of the land itself. She felt herself changing, becoming something else, something more. Her body dissolved into light, her consciousness expanded, her self merged with the greater whole that was the guardian. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the folklorist. She was the guardian's hand, the seal's strength, the binding support. And she was not alone. Elan was there, surrounding her, welcoming her, sharing the burden that had been his alone for so long. "Thank you," he whispered, and she felt his relief, his gratitude, his hope. "Thank you," she replied, "for holding the line, for keeping us safe, for being the guardian." Together they turned their attention to the monsters. The Wendigo and Skinwalker were still there, still fighting, still struggling. But they were weaker now, their power fading, their hatred contained by the renewed strength of the seal. The battle would continue, the vigil would never end. The guardian, now guardians, plural, would maintain the seal forever. But they would not be alone. Others would come, would join, would share the burden. A tradition would be established, a priesthood of guardians, a sacred duty passed from generation to generation. The monsters would remain bound, the reservation would remain safe, the land would be protected. And in the darkness below, the guardians would watch and wait and keep the eternal vigil. Forever. The wind howled across the mesa, carrying dust and the smell of rain. Kiana Yazzie pulled her jacket tighter against the chill, her eyes fixed on the horizon where dark clouds were gathering. She was 26, a ranger like her gray uncle Elan had been, though she had never met him. He had disappeared before she was born, become a legend before she could walk. But she knew his story. Everyone on the reservation knew it, the way they knew the stories of the holy people, of changing woman, of the monsters that lurked in the dark places. Elan Yazzie, the ranger who became a god, the guardian who held back the ice and the skin thief, the protector who watched from below. She had felt his presence once, when she was a child. A nightmare, or so she had thought, in which something massive and warm had surrounded her, had protected her from something cold and hungry that reached for her from the shadows. She had woken with the taste of corn pollen on her lips and the certainty that she had been blessed. Now she was drawn to the kiva, to the sealed place where her ancestor kept his eternal vigil. She didn't know why she had come today, what instinct or intuition had guided her steps, but she knew, with the certainty of her people's ancient wisdom, that she was meant to be here. The shrine was still maintained after all these years. Flowers in clay pots, candles in glass holders, photographs and prayers and offerings. The crack that Dr. Chen had opened was still visible, a narrow opening that led down into darkness. Kiana approached it slowly, reverently. She was a ranger, trained in the modern ways, educated in the universities, equipped with technology and science. But she was also Dene Navajo, a child of the people. She knew that some things could not be explained by science, could not be understood by reason, could only be accepted with humility and respect. "Hello," she called softly into the crack. "Guardian Elan." Silence answered her. Then slowly, a warmth that rose from the earth that surrounded her, that filled her with peace and comfort. "Child of my blood," a voice whispered, and it was her great uncle's voice, though she had never heard it before. "I have waited for you." "I'm here," she said, tears in her eyes. "I'm here, uncle." "You are strong, you are brave, you are ready." "Ready for what?" "To learn, to serve, to protect. The seal holds, but it weakens. The guardians, Sarah and I, we are strong, but we are only two. We need more, we need you." Kiana understood in that moment what her great uncle was offering. Not power, not glory, not immortality. Duty, responsibility, the eternal vigil, the sacrifice of self for the protection of others. I'm a ranger, she said. Like you were, I protect the land, the people, the animals, but I can't. I can't become what you are, not yet. I have family, I have obligations, I have a life. I know, I don't ask for your sacrifice, only your service. Be our eyes in the world above, be our voice among the people, be our connection to the living as we are your connection to the eternal. I can do that. Then take this. The warmth intensified, coalescing into something solid in her hands. She looked down and found herself holding a stone turquoise, carved with symbols she didn't recognize, humming with power. A piece of the seal, a fragment of the sacred earth. It will let you speak with us, hear us, know when danger approaches. Kiana closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its warmth, its weight, its presence. I'll serve, she promised. I'll watch, I'll protect. You are your father's daughter, the guardian said, and she heard pride in his voice. You are worthy of the Yazi name. Go now and remember, the dark is patient, but so are we. The warmth receded, leaving her alone on the mesa, holding the stone, crying tears she didn't fully understand. She looked at the sky, where the storm was building, and felt the weight of her duty settle onto her shoulders. She would serve, she would watch, she would protect. And someday, perhaps, when she was old and her children were grown, she might return to this place and offer herself as her great-uncle had, as Dr. Chen had, becoming part of the eternal vigil. But for now, she had work to do. The reservation needed rangers, needed protectors, needed people who remembered the old stories and kept the old ways alive. She turned and walked back to her truck, the stone warm in her pocket, the guardian's blessing surrounding her like a cloak. The cycle continued. The vigil went on, and the land was protected as it had always been by those who were willing to pay the price. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.